Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Hunting the Wolfman. Old man Jess Benson, cattleman and mine owner, rode across the high plateau which divided the rich grazing lands between Rock Valley and Slater Canyon. He let his horse pick its way down the steep slope to Slater Creek. Here, as the sorrel slaked its thirst, the big man in the saddle filled and lit his pipe, while his eyes moved slowly through the sprinkle of cottonwoods which fringed the creek. His cattle roamed this vast country, and a few were missing. He hoped they'd wandered down through the gully and headed along the creek bank. Well, about 50 feet upstream, close to a large boulder and partly behind a clump of stunted mesquite, half a dozen magpies were quarreling over something that the rider could not clearly distinguish. He could see something dark behind the bushes, a carcass of a cow or a steer probably, and he watched the beautiful black and white birds speculatively as they uttered their shrill, raucous cries. They fluttered about the thicket. Well, since there was a possibility that dead animal might be carrying his brand, Benson turned his horse in the direction of the birds. A minute later, having reached the spot from which he could command a clear view of the thing that lay behind the bushes, his sunburnt cheeks went ashen, and he swung himself to the ground with the exclamation of horrified surprise. Close to the thicket and 5 or 6 feet from the rock was the body of a man. He was lying partly on his side, one leg drawn up and the other outstretched, while both arms were bent under him. His face and neck were terribly torn and mangled, and his flannel shirt had been ripped half off his body, which was bruised and covered with wounds. Several paces away was a trampled felt hat, and the muzzle of a revolver peeped from beneath the body, its butt evidently clutched in the stiffened fingers of one hand. For a dozen feet around the man, the ground was torn and trampled as though a terrible struggle had taken place. For several minutes, Benson stood still and eyed the ghastly thing in horrified fascination. Long-time experience as a range rider told him that the body and the signs of conflict about it could not be more than 48 hours old. This thing had happened since a heavy rain of 2 days before, and it slowly dawned on the cattleman that the dead man was Nathan Smith, a neighbor of his who owned a small farm about 5 or 6 miles away. For some time he studied the body and the surrounding soil very carefully, noting especially that the soft earth was covered with large, dog-like tracks. And then he went to his horse and he untied his slicker from the back of the saddle. With this garment, he managed to cover the body so that the magpies could no longer get to it. Then he mounted his horse and rode off toward Elk, 10 miles away. Well, Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris, the coroner, happened to be together in the sheriff's office. They were drinking a cup of coffee when Benson entered and told his story to him. Both men listened without any particular comment, and at the end, the sheriff got to his feet. "I'll run you both out in the truck," the sheriff said. "We can reach the spot easily enough by following the old road up the creek, and then we can walk in from there." From what Benson says, this thing does not look like a crime exactly. It seems more like the work of wolves, though I never heard of any wolf attacking a man in this region, but can never tell. At any rate, we'd better go look into it as soon as we can. When the 3 men eventually reached the spot, Doc Morris lifted the slicker up and stooped over the gruesome object beneath it, while Sheriff Parker gazed at the trodden ground with interest. While the coroner made his examination, the officer paced around the thicket. He was eyeing the tracks thoughtfully. More than once he stooped to apply a pocket ruler to some especially distinct impression, and twice he whistled softly to himself. By the time the doctor's examination had ended, he was turning a speculative eye toward a dim trail which led off at right angles through the cottonwood. Returning from washing his hands at the edge of the creek, Doc Morris looked at his friend in contemplative silence, and he lit a cigar and puffed at it nervously. Well, the sheriff questioned at length, what was it? What do you think killed him? Heck if I know, Bert. I never saw anything like this before in all my experience. It was an animal of some kind, I can say that for sure. A wolf, most likely. Although, as you said earlier, the few wolves we have around here have never been known to attack humans. But the man is frightfully mangled. His jugular vein is torn out of him. Had his gun in his hand, too. It's empty. He must have fought that thing hard, whatever it was. The tracks certainly look like wolf. But I ain't never seen a wolf track that big. And there's something else, too. He hesitated as if he really didn't believe what he was about to say. Sheriff Park shivered and nodded in an absent way, his eyes still fixed on the faint trail through the trees and the weeds. You talking about the tracks? Doc Morris let out a big sigh. Yep. Remember when we were boys, the sheriff said? Remember that kid in class that disappeared? I've forgotten his name, but I remember that his body was never found. And then a couple of months later, that girl went missing. Everyone thought she'd run off with her boyfriend, but he swore up and down that he knew nothing about her disappearance. And then there was that family that was camping down by the river. And the fisherman who left all his gear and tackle that was never seen again, Morris added. Benson piped up, yeah, and lots of missing cattle and dogs and, well, even a couple of hunters. But as far as I know, there's never been a closed case. What do you think we're dealing with here? I don't know, said the sheriff. This one's different. This time we have a body, mangled as it is, and tracks that look pretty fresh. Maybe it heard you coming along and ran off before it had time to... He couldn't finish his sentence. He shook his head and frowned. Jess Benson, with horror written all over his face, stared at the two men as they talked. I don't feel safe out here on horseback. I've dealt with a lot of beasts in my years here, cougars and wolves and bear, but this one here is the devil himself. Sheriff Parker made no answer, but Benson caught a glance between Morris and him that he didn't like. There was something they were talking about, and there was something they weren't telling him. Sheriff Parker continued to search the ground around the body a few minutes longer, as though he wished to make doubly sure that his suspicions were correct. Then he helped the others wrap the body in a blanket, and they carried it to the back of the truck. And 5 minutes later, save for the trampled ground and some dull brown, ominous stains on the grass, there was no apparent sign of the tragedy. Well, 2 hours later, seated at his desk with that cigar between his teeth, Sheriff Parker squinted through his glasses at Doc Morris, who sat opposite him. I tell you, Doc, the sheriff was saying, if I had not been studying the results of this creature's work for the past 6 weeks, I wouldn't believe that such a creature existed. I grew up hearing about this beast, but I always thought it was legend. You know, the kind of stuff that parents make up to keep the young'uns home at night. And then when you add up all the cases of missing people and animals over the last 30-some years, it's got me wondering just what kind of beast we're dealing with. Well, aside from its tracks, the coroner mused, no one around here that I know of has ever had an eyewitness account. It leaves the track in the ground larger by far than any full-grown timber wolf, and it certainly can fight. Benson said his hounds were mangled by it last week, and now Smith. He was a very powerful man and armed. But so far as we know, the thing killed him and got away unscathed. The man's body looked as if it had been struck by a train. The chest and sides might have been beaten in with a sledgehammer. His clothes were torn to shreds, and, well, as for his throat, the less said about that, the better. Sheriff Parker didn't say anything for a few minutes. And getting to his feet, he began to pace, slowly back and forth across the room. Fingers were interlaced behind his back, and his head bowed in the way he sometimes did when he was in deep thought. He was struggling with a problem the like of which he'd never experienced before. Somehow he had to find a way to identify and then get rid of this beast that was terrorizing the valley. So what we're dealing with here is larger than a full-grown timber wolf, has the strength of a grizzly, and is quiet and cunning as a cougar. But what really has me puzzled are the tracks we saw. They were elongated and looked almost human, but enormous, like some giant, barefoot, half-man, half-wolf beast. It just doesn't add up. Well, almost 6 weeks before Jack Moore, a stock inspector, whose duties often carried him far out into the thinly settled portions of the county, had noticed several cattle had been brutally mauled to death. Cattle mutilations were becoming a common sight this far out in the country, and it was troubling for both the ranchers and the Stockmen's Association. It didn't help that the newspapers, they just sensationalized the story, and then on top of that, you had all the crazies that claimed it was UFOs and alien abductions and such. Well, Jack was a cattleman, a third-generation rancher, and he'd never seen anything like this. But he wasn't about to believe it was something supernatural. At first, the authorities and the ranchers had attributed the cattle maulings and mutilations to timber wolves, for the sole reason that they could attribute it to nothing else. The tracks around the bodies, though exceedingly large, were shaped like wolves, and the bodies themselves had been torn and mangled as if by some carnivorous animal. Jack hadn't seen the other tracks, the ones that looked more elongated, but even if he had, he wouldn't have believed his eyes. People saw what they were willing to see, and nothing outside of that existed. Well, soon after the cattle, a dozen sheep were killed in their pasture. Then, on the heels of this, Buck Humphrey, a prosperous rancher whose word was beyond dispute, with 2 of his hired men, had seen something rush through their hayfield right at tree line. Something they couldn't make out, though it was broad daylight. They could see the tall hay wave and shake, and they could even hear the creature as it thrashed about there, but it held back in the shadows. Well, they drew their rifles, but they couldn't see the beast well enough to get a good shot. Then Jess Benson's hounds, a pack of 14 which had never met its match, and in many encounters with wolves and coyotes, had been soundly whooped. The 3 of them killed outright in a fight with some kind of animal. Now, as a climax to this whole business had come Nathan Smith's horrible death, and no man could say who or what would be the next victim. As he thought over all these things for the 100th time, Sheriff Parker racked his brain to form some plan for trapping and killing the beast. It was his job. He knew there must be a way, somehow, to make an end to the terror, even though the most skillful trappers and hunters in the county had failed to discover it. The animal's range was known. It seemed for the most part to frequent the country between Slater Creek and White Horse Mountain, probably because the region contained plenty of timber and natural shelter. Well, Sheriff Parker was deep in thought when his phone rang. "Howdy, Sheriff. Jack Moore here. Sorry to bother you this late, but we got a problem out here on Humphreys. Old man Buck is dead, and you're not going to believe what we found out here." Sheriff Parker grabbed his Stetson off the hat rack and headed for the door. He called out to his deputy to lock up for the night and ran to his truck. It was a good hour's drive out to the Humphreys ranch, and Parker called up Morris to come along. Morris was waiting outside when the sheriff pulled up at his place. "What's up? What happened?" he asked. "Well, old Buck Humphrey's dead. Jack Moore's out there with that other hired hands. Says they found something out there that we won't believe. Wouldn't say anything else, just say I got to see it to believe it." Doc Morris just stared at him, had nothing to say. The 2 men sat in silence the rest of the way as Parker sped toward Humphrey's ranch. One of the hired hands was waiting at the gate to let the sheriff's truck in. Then he closed the gate and followed his dust in an old white pickup. The Humphreys homestead was lit up like a lantern, lights shining from all the windows. Buck's wife, Columbine, she was sitting on the front porch, and Jack had his arm around her, comforting her as she cried onto his shoulder. He gently handed her over to another hired hand who helped her back into the house, and Jack walked over to the 2 men and just got there. Jack told the sheriff that he'd been out on the range earlier that afternoon inspecting cattle. He was on horseback when he spotted what looked like an enormous grizzly in the far distance, and he heard Buck's dog barking up a storm. Whatever it was that dog was barking at, it looked too big to be a wolf, so thinking it was a bear and possibly within shooting distance, he pulled his rifle from the scabbard and loosed a shot at it. He watched as the beast stood up, looked his direction, then let out an ear-splitting roar and ran off into the trees. "Ran off," he repeated, "on 2 legs. And then he saw Buck's dog chasing the beast off into the timber. He took off running his horse at top speed towards the site, and he found Buck Humphrey laying there, his guts torn out of his stomach and half his arm torn off. He quickly removed his neck bandana and tied a tourniquet around what was left of Buck's arm and removed his shirt to try to staunch the bleeding of Buck's stomach, but he knew Buck didn't stand a chance. Buck was trying to whisper something but couldn't find his voice. He pointed, though, over toward some bushes near where he lay, and Jack's eyes followed the direction of the pointing finger. There in the bushes lay Buck's horse, dead and ripped to shreds. But what Buck was pointing at was not the horse, but the massive tracks that surrounded the horse. They were humanoid in shape, but ended in long, curving claws like a wolf's. And this was not something Jack's eyes could believe. There was nothing Jack could do for Buck. Buck had taken his last breath, and the horse was dead, and the dog was gone. Jack decided the best thing he could do was race back to the house and get help. Jack and the ranch hands thought it was best to wait until the sheriff and the doc arrived to investigate the scene. And when Jack finally finished telling his story, it was getting near dark, so they gathered flashlights and lanterns and went by horseback out to the site where Jack had last seen Buck, their guns at the ready in case the beast had returned to the kill site. When they finally reached the spot, they found Buck's mangled body and the horse, and with their flashlights they could see numerous tracks, enormous and human-like, yet they did not end in human-shaped toes, but more like the pads of dogs with claw points that extended past the print. Man or beast? Man and beast? Suddenly the men heard a noise running towards them, and in unison they all raised their guns at the ready. But before anyone could let loose a shot, one of the hired hands yelled, "It's Old Blue, Buck's dog, don't shoot." Out of the bushes that lined the timber came the Old Blue Aussie, running straight at him. He was unhurt and had apparently abandoned his chase of the beast, and was lucky that it had not caught him, and lucky he hadn't been shot by the surprised and anxious men. Well, they loaded Buck onto a travois and headed back to the ranch house. They'd have to come back in the morning to take some plaster casts of the prints. Sheriff Parker poured himself another cup of coffee. It had been a long night. Who would be the next victim? Now that Jack had actually sighted the beast, at least they kind of knew what they were up against. But what exactly did that mean? A creature that is supposed to exist only in legends? Were there more? And if we were to believe that giant wolf-like creatures actually existed, then does that open up the possibility for werewolves and vampires too? Sheriff Parker snickered under his breath. This story would create a media storm. And were they ready for that? And the phone rang. It was Jack Moore. "Morning, Sheriff. I've been doing some thinking and I might have come up with a plan." An hour later, 4 men sat in a booth at Mary's Diner drinking coffee. Jack Moore, Sheriff Parker, Doc Morris, and Jess Benson. "Let's pack up our horses and plenty of guns and ammo and start tracking that beast," Jess said. "Now, think about it. All animals need to drink. What water source is out there besides the creek?" "Well, Silver Lake is 10 miles from here. I know that's not far, but I say we dam up the creek temporarily so there's no water flow below Clark's Meadow. That'll draw it up on the hill. Now it could head to Silver Lake, but I doubt it. I think the food is plentiful here, with what all the cattle and sheep in the valley, so I think it'll stay in this general area. We dam up the water and force it to Clark's Meadow, where we'll have a posse of men hiding out in tree platforms and duck blinds. It's about all we can do." "Well, it's worth a try," Sheriff Parker replied. "I'll put out word and draw some deputies and rangers from the neighboring county, maybe gather a few ranchers to help us. Let's see what we can pull together, and I'll get someone up there to dam that creek today." Well, a week later, 10 men unloaded their horse trailers at various locations around Clark's Meadow. They knew they had to take this creature by surprise, and they had no doubt it would be watching them. Old Jess Benson had moved some cattle out to graze the meadow and hardly taken notice of a couple of them missing. A small sacrifice to pay to rid this valley of this monster predator. Well, far up on Benson's Ridge, Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris met up with Jess, who was surveying a couple of dead steers. The lifeless forms that littered the ground had been badly mangled and half-eaten. They took it as a good sign that the beast was hunting and he was close by. "What's the plan, Sheriff?" Benson asked. "We've got rangers and deputies circling the meadow on horseback looking for tracks. We'll rendezvous tonight at Benson's Gulch and everyone will get their placement. I know it's a long shot, but we've got to hope that the beast will come up the meadow to drink. The creek's been dammed and the water's already flowing into the meadow." Now, that evening, they built a campfire and everyone sat around it. They discussed what they'd seen or hadn't seen during their earlier scouting missions. Several tracks had been followed, and those who had seen tracks compared notes on size, stride, direction, and whether they'd seen single tracks from one beast or if there was the possibility of more than one. They needed to know how many they were dealing with. No one there that night had ever seen tracks like this before, and everyone was really on edge. In the days following up to this gathering, several of the men had read everything they could get their hands on regarding, wolves and werewolves and wendigos and Bigfoot. Books on the subject suggested that while wolves are territorial and they travel in packs, the lone wolf's not uncommon, but wendigos and werewolves are nearly always singular. A wendigo or a werewolf. It was still difficult to wrap their heads around the possibility that this is what they were dealing with here. These were legends, and not one man in the group was the type to believe in these kinds of imaginary beasts. They were countrymen. They had to deal with realistic things every day. But with the recent death of Nathan Smith, they knew that whatever this beast was, it would just as likely hunt and kill a human as it would a cow or sheep, and if they didn't get to it first. As they sat around the campfire, they could hear a wolf howling in the distance. Its long, drawn-out cry that all men recognize instinctively. Melodious, yet with a tone that sends a shudder right up your spine. Someone in the circle began telling a story about the 3 calls of the hunting wolf. The long, drawn-out, deep howl that tells of game discovered, but too strong for the finder to manage alone. And then the higher ululation, like a ringing or swelling in the cry of the pack on a hot scent. And then the sharp bark coupled with a short howl that, seeming least of all, is yet the sound of doom, for this is the cry of closing in on the prey. Now, buffalo used to roam this valley, followed by bands of wolves that preyed on the sick, the weak, and the wounded. When the buffalo were exterminated, the wolves suffered, until the cattle came along. The ranchman had fought them ever since. Cowboys that were out of work could always make a few bucks killing wolves. The ranchers supplied them with traps and poison. Some cowboys became so good at this that they became known as wolvers. Benson remarked that his grandfather had been a wolver, and he remembered the old man saying that never in all his experience had he known a gray wolf to attack a human being. Times had changed. Outside in the trees, the coyotes had begun their yapping chorus, followed by a wolf's howl. 2 of the dogs arose, and with bristling manes, they began barking. Everyone, including the dogs, were on edge, and they knew danger was nearby. Everyone was up and loaded before the first light of dawn crested the horizon. They agreed on their prospective locations, and that if they should see anything, 1 shot meant attention, and another shot 10 seconds later meant come now. Anything other than that, such as rapid gunfire, well, that was to mean trouble. The tracks were easy to find, but seemed to lead the men to all sorts of roundabout forays. Here they lead to an old cow skull. Here he had shied off and swung cautiously upwind. There at length he had mounted a low hill and sat down. The dog's hair bristled as they sniffed those places, and they got excited with the scent. Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris were riding together and crested a tall hill to get a better viewpoint of the meadow down below. The ground was littered with fresh tracks. It was clear the beast had been watching the men from up on that hill and could not be far away. Well, the chase led downward to the low valley just below where the creek had been dammed. Within another mile, the tracks led into a willow thicket. "I don't like the looks of this," Doc Morris said. "It feels like a trap." Just then, the 2 men saw a horse bounding up the game path through the thick willows, as if being chased. A saddle was on the horse, but there was no rider. "That is Tim's horse," Sheriff Parker yelled. He spurred his horse into a run in the direction of the lone horse had come from, and there, up ahead around the bend, was the ranger, Tim Bradshaw. The ranger had fallen but was still alive. He was wounded in several places and had a large gash across his forehead, and his chest was scored with the marks of giant claws. The buzzards were circling ever lower, experts at recognizing oncoming death. Tim was barely conscious when the men reached him. They tied a tourniquet round his chest and to staunch the bleeding, and a bandana over the gash on his head, and helped him to sit up and take a drink from the canteen. Sheer courage and the will to ignore the pain that racked his entire body kept Tim alive. He could barely move. He wiped the blood from his eyes, but his vision was fogged. His horse had bolted from the fear of whatever had attacked the ranger. But now the big horse cautiously walked back up the game trail and stood motionless near the other two horses. It called for an almost superhuman effort for Tim to mount the horse, and with Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris assisting him up into the saddle. He made no attempt to sit erect. Instead, he leaned far forward, fighting desperately against the constantly increasing nausea that threatened to deprive him of his consciousness, and probably his life. The sheriff led the horse and the rider out of the willows into the clearing of the meadow. The buzzards were still circling overhead. Well, the afternoon sun was blazing down on Sentinel Butte as the men returned to the camp to get Tim loaded into a truck and taken to the hospital in town. As they reached the turn where the truck and the horse trailer were parked, a deep-toned howl came from the flat valley below, followed by a number of higher-pitched howls and answering chorus. It was the hunting cry of the wolves. Doc Morris drove Tim into town to the hospital, and Sheriff Parker joined Jess Benson and Jack Moore to relay what had happened in the willows. They saw two other rangers coming out of the trees over by the creek and rode up to them to inquire what they'd seen. Apparently, tracks were everywhere. Either this thing was keeping a mighty range or there was more than one of them. They couldn't help feel that this creature knew their every move and was always one step ahead of them. Well, before Tim had been knocked off his horse, he had seen the creature dart out of the willows and rear up on two mighty legs, raking him with razor-sharp claws. Just as the beast swung for his head, he ducked, and the horse reared at the same time, knocking him clean off his horse. This probably saved his life. The horse took off running, and the beast ran after the horse. It seemed to be more interested in the chase rather than stopping to kill and eat its fallen prey. Well, the horse had escaped simply because the beast ran when it heard Parker and Morris. It was like a game of cat and mouse. The sheriff shot one shot up in the air to get the attention of the other scouts, and he waited 10 seconds, and then he shot another signal. Remember, that was their come on in signal. Well, it was late afternoon, and he wanted to make sure everyone was accounted for before dusk. They cooked a good dinner over the campfire, and they made plans for the following day. "I don't want anyone out there alone. Tim Bradshaw should have had a partner with him today. I thought we'd agreed on that. Now he's sitting up there in the hospital and lucky to be alive. We can't have any mistakes. Agreed?" Everyone did agree to that. The sky was thick with stars, and the forest was silent. There was no wind, no stir of branches. Only the crackle of snapping twigs was audible from time to time as the little night creatures moved around through the underbrush. Not even the coyotes called that night. The silence was eerie and unsettling. Just like cowboys of the Old West, they had placed their sleeping bags in a circle around the campfire for warmth and protection, but not one of them was able to sleep. There was a frosty touch to the air as the men drank their morning coffee and prepared for the day's scouting. The forest was silent. There was no wind, no stir of branches. Only the crackle of the snapping twigs was audible from time to time. They loaded their provisions on their horses and they set out in groups of 2 and 4 to the various scouting locations. Parker and Morris rode out with the 2 Garrison brothers, following a line of tracks that ascended some 800 to 1,000 feet up Sentinel Butte to a well-worn game trail. The trees were thinner and more sparsely placed up here in the higher elevation. The silver birch and the sumac were already turning into fall colors, but there were still red currants on the bushes and an abundance of wild rose hips. The cattle don't generally wander up this high, but there were deer and elk tracks as well as an occasional pile of bear scat. The men came upon a quiet pool fed by a clear crystal stream and stopped for a moment to let their horses drink. It was obvious that their prey had stopped here as well. Fresh tracks could be seen in the mud, crossing the stream, and were very distinct in the marshy ground above the pool. Parker got down off his horse to take a measurement of the track when he caught sight of movement in the trees about 40 yards from where he stood. He raised his finger to his lips, then made a motion with his hand to indicate the direction he saw the movement to the other men, who quickly raised their rifles and silenced their horses. Cautiously stepping outside of the protection of the trees, a giant wolf, larger than the men had ever seen, started towards them. The giant beast's head was lowered, his enormous shoulders hunched slightly forward as if he was preparing to spring upon them like a cat stalking its prey. The men watched in awe as the wolf-like creature raised his head and cried out a blood-curdling, ear-splitting howl. No one moved. Each one waited for the other to make the first move. Their raised rifles at the ready, men and beast stared into each other's eyes for a length of time that seemed like forever. A snarl and a low growl could be heard. If he would just come a little closer, they would get good, clean shots. Suddenly, from down in the valley, several shots rang out, taking all four men by surprise. Involuntarily, and just for a split second, in unison, they glanced toward the loud explosion of gunfire, giving the giant wolf the opportunity to spring at them. All four men began firing their rifles at the giant beast as it closed in on them. The wolf took repeated blows, but the bullets merely knocked it back for a fraction of a second, and then it continued its charge toward the men. Hank Garrison's horse spooked and nearly threw him, but Hank managed to stay the saddle and got off one more shot straight into the giant beast's head. It let out an enormous roar and fell to its feet, scrambling to right itself, and more gunfire tore into its massive bulk. It was down. The men stayed back, ready to fire more if needed. They got a good look at the beast as it lay there in the final throes of death. It was stretched out and with great muscular thighs quivering. The beast's head and shoulders were enormous. The fur was dark and matted under the blood that was pulling up around him. The rush of excitement turned into a sense of relief as they waited for the beast to breathe his final breaths. The horses were nervous, their nostrils flaring in and out as the giant wolf succumbed. It was as if the horses sensed the kill and felt the soul of the giant beast leave its body. Hank's horse was pawing at the ground, whinnying, and he turned it into a couple of circles to try to steady it. It was just too much for that horse, and he strained to bolt away. Hank let it fall behind the others, and he desperately tried to calm him. They didn't want to leave the kill, not until they were absolutely sure that the beast was dead. But the shots that had rang out in the valley below had them disturbed. Sheriff Parker told the doc to head back with Hank towards a meadow and see if the other rangers needed assistance. He'd stay here with Lance Garrison to watch over the beast and keep an eye on the surroundings. Hank and Doc headed out. Parker pulled his pistol out of its holster to put a final bullet in the beast's skull. They still didn't know if there were more of them. Lance kept his rifle pointed at the beast's head while Parker got off his horse and walked within 10 feet. There was no more quivering of the muscles, no visible signs of the chest contracting with breath. He raised his pistol to fire one shot into the massive head when he noticed a barely perceptible shudder. It made him jump back just a bit, probably just the natural contraction of muscles, as is common in death, he thought to himself. He aimed his pistol and fired. The features of the beast seemed to have changed, just slightly, but enough for Sheriff Parker to notice. Lance tied the horses up to a nearby tree and knelt down next to Parker, watching the strange transformation that was taking place. It was barely perceptible, yet the body seemed to be changing, shrinking right before their eyes. For another 20 minutes, the two men knelt beside the beast, their transfixed gaze on the slowly changing animal form in front of them. The giant, extended forehead appeared to be receding. The neck, which was previously the size of a fully grown man's waist, it was getting narrower, and the shoulders appeared to be shrinking and smoothing. Lance broke off a large branch from a nearby tree and measured the length of the body with the stick. The men wished the others would get up there to see the transformation taking place. It was a sure thing no one would believe them. In the valley below, Hank and Doc reached the meadow after more than an hour of brisk riding. Several of the other riders were already rendezvoused at the campsite. Doc yelled out, "Hey there, what was all that shooting about?" "Simmons had the beast treed," Tom Horn hollered back. "What? Wolves don't climb trees," Hank exclaimed. Doc and Hank dismounted and tied up their horses, then joined the group. "Tell us what happened," Doc said. Well, Tom Horn proceeded to tell the story yet again. He and Simmons had been across the meadow near the willows where Tim had had the accident the day before. Both of them had dogs, and as they got close to the creek, the dogs started barking and ran into the willows. Tom and Simmons followed, rifles drawn. All of a sudden, a beast came bounding up the game trail with both dogs barking at its heels, heading straight for the two men on horseback. It reared up on two mighty legs, took a great swipe at one of the dogs, and lunged toward the men who were both emptying their ammo into this giant beast. It turned and ran toward a stand of lodgepole pine and climbed up the tree like a cat. The dogs, they circled around it like they'd treat a squirrel. Well, Simmons had a shotgun, and Tom reloaded his rifle, and they shot and killed the beast. It took several swings at him, and then it fell out of the tree. Then the damnedest thing happened, Tom said. You're not going to believe the rest of the story, Doc. Meanwhile, Lance and Parker were watching the other wolf beast go through a strange, unnatural transformation themselves. Neither of them could believe their eyes, and if there weren't two of them, they'd have swore it was their imagination getting the best of them. The wolf lying there in front of them was no longer a wolf. Lying there with blood pooling around his wounds was none other than Gunther Jaeger. And across the meadow, a good 5 miles away from her husband, lay the body of Hannah Jaeger. The Jaegers had moved to the valley from Germany many years ago. They were quiet folk, struck to themselves mostly, didn't like to socialize, and they really weren't very neighborly. They owned a big spread about 15 miles from Buck Humphrey's ranch, but mostly they grew corn and alfalfa. Thinking back on it now, the year they moved to the valley was about the time when the deer population seemed to dwindle. It was also the year that the young boy went missing. They probably accounted for many of the other, if not all, the missing person and missing animal cases over the past 30-some years. The rangers gathered up the bodies and took them back to town. The newspapers would sport the headline, "Couple killed in hunting accident." Not one man in the scouting party wanted the truth to get out. It was just too strange a story. Nobody would believe it anyway. Would you? Son of the Wolf, Part 2 of the Wolfman Series. Well, Jack Moore, cattleman and brand inspector, now turned bounty hunter, rode his horse through the densely tangled woods of the Hall Rainforest in western Washington, on the west side of the Olympic National Park. So this is what the phrase primordial darkness means, he thought to himself. A phrase that suggests not only blackness, but unseen things lurking in the blackness, creatures that skulk in the deep shadows and shun the light of day. Slinking figures that prowl beyond the edge of normal life. Such thoughts flitted vaguely through his mind that night as he groped along the narrow trail that wound through the deep forested land. Such thoughts are likely to keep company with any man who dares hiking through that lonely stretch of densely timbered forest at night. It's wet, it's dark, and it's scary, and his nerves were on edge. There is no blackness this side of hell as absolute as the blackness of these dark woods, so dense that no moonlight can filter through the upper canopy of branches and moss. Well, the trail was merely just a trace of a different color, winding between the walls of solid ebony. His horse followed as if by instinct, both man and horse, with razor-sharp senses. This caution did not spring from the uncanny speculations roused by the darkness and the silence, nor by the superstitious hordes of tourists that frequented this part of the country, and they were searching for vampires and Bigfoot. The town of Forks, Washington, was only an hour away, and was made hugely popular by the movie Twilight, in which a vampire falls in love with a human girl. Now the tourists flocked to this tiny little town, hoping to relieve the excitement of the girl wooed by that young, handsome vampire. No, Jack had a good material reason to be wary. Vampires might roam the rainforest with bloody throats and cannibalistic hunger, as the locals maintained. But it was no vampire he feared. He listened for the snap of a twig or any sound that would forewarn murder striking from the black shadows. The creature he feared and was more familiar with was a wolf. A couple of years ago, Jack would have laughed at the idea of hunting a beast the likes of which he was now on the hunt for. He was a conservative man. He wasn't taking the whims of fancy or superstitions. But earlier that week, the deadliest criminal in Montana had broken from the clutches of the law, leaving a ghastly toll of dead behind him, causing a manhunt that stretched from Montana through Idaho and on into Washington, where he was now. Rangers with bloodhounds baying through the brush and hard-eyed men with rifles were beating through the thickets. Helicopters hovered over the places searchers couldn't easily hike to, and they were seeking him near the towns and tributaries of the Snake River. But Jack knew him better than they did. He knew he was unbelievably primitive, enough to plunge into uninhabited wilderness and hunt like a lone wolf in solitude that would have terrified and daunted any other man. And Jack also knew what he was really after: revenge. So while the hunt flowed in other directions, Jack drove his horse trailer to Port Angeles, and he rented a small hotel room. He had scouted out the area earlier, and he had phoned Parker to join him. Sheriff Parker was retired now, but he had been part of the scouting party that had brought down Gunther and Hannah Jaeger in Montana. Very few people knew the truth of what really happened out there by Clark's Meadow, and Jack was just as happy keeping it that way. Gunther and Hannah had a son who was just turning into a man when his parents were killed in a hunting accident. The townsfolk raised enough money for the boy to go off to college to Montana State University for pre-veterinary medicine, and then on to Washington State University's College of Veterinary Medicine. Now he'd come back to Montana and he'd set up a small veterinary practice in Kalispell. But he apparently had developed a taste for his patients. And after much investigation, he lost his vet license and was thrown in jail. His taste for animal flesh soon led to human flesh, as prey was abundant in the jails. Rumor has it that the guards would put their more obnoxious prisoners in a cell with Hans Jaeger just to get rid of them. They didn't care if the fellows got eaten. But somehow the press got wind of the story and all hell broke loose. Now it was determined that Hans should be placed in a mental institution under complete solitary lockdown, and during the transport, as you might guess, he somehow managed to break free, killing all the guards and the policemen who were transporting him. But it was not just to look for Hans Jaeger that Jack plunged into that isolated wilderness. His mission was one of warning rather than searching, for deep in the maze of this pine labyrinth, a man who went by the name of Doc Morris lived alone in a cabin on the outer boundary of the national park. Parker and Moore felt it was their duty to warn Doc that a red-handed killer might be skulking about his cabin. It was rumored that Hans Jaeger was searching for the men who had killed his parents, and the men who were responsible for that hunting accident were none other than Sheriff Parker, Jack Moore, Jess Benson, Lance and Hank Garrison, Tom Horn, and Doc Morris. Well, two of the others were now dead. Tim Bradshaw had died from his injuries sustained during the wolf hunt, and Jim Simmons had hung himself shortly after the event. Apparently, he'd been having an affair with Hannah Jaeger on and off over the years and just couldn't bear the thought that he'd been somewhat responsible for her very death. Jack Moore knew that Doc Morris had moved to the Haw rainforest shortly after the event in Montana. He was a recluse, suspicious of everyone, and he'd been living in an old cabin on the densely forested outskirts of the Haw for the last couple of years. Knowing that Hans had spent a few years away at college in Washington, Jack had a hunch that this would be the first man he'd hunt down. The Haw rainforest was dense and it was easy to hide in. There'd be lots of tourists to prey upon. Perfect hunting grounds for a man or wolf like Hans Jaeger. Parker wouldn't be arriving for a couple more days, and Jack didn't want to wait. He felt the urgency to let Doc know that Hans was loose. And since Doc's phone didn't get any reception out there in the forest where he was, there was no other way of reaching him in a timely manner. So he had decided to set out on his own, against his own better judgment. He tried to find Doc's cabin on the GPS map on his phone, but had no luck. He knew there must be a way to drive into the cabin, but he had no idea where that road might be or what it might be called. So he decided he'd saddle up his horse and just head up the Haw River Trail. According to Parker, the cabin was just on the outside of the park boundary, and it was tucked right up against the river, deep in the forest of a giant Sitka spruce, red cedar, big leaf maple, and Douglas fir. Giant trees, all of them, and perfect location for someone wanting to hide away from the world. Well, it was much darker than he had anticipated. He'd gotten a late start, but the forest was so thick that it appeared to be a lot later in the day, and before long it would be nightfall. Well, Jack was wondering if he should turn around and start out early the next morning, when suddenly he heard a noise several yards up the trail. He stopped dead in his tracks, pulling sharply on the reins, the nerves tingling in the skin on the backs of his hands. A sudden shriek in the dark has that effect, and the scream was edged with both agony and terror. It came from somewhere ahead of him. Breathless silence followed the cry, a silence in which the forest seemed to hold its breath, and the darkness shut in more blackly still. Again the scream was repeated, this time closer. Then he heard the pounding of bare feet along the trail, and a form hurled itself out of the darkness. With revolver in hand, Jack instinctively thrust it out to fend the creature off. The only thing that kept him from pulling the trigger was the noise the object was making. It was gasping, sobbing, noises of fear and pain. It was a man, and he fell at Jack's feet, slobbering and yammering. "Help me," a voice called out in sheer agony. Well, he shined his flashlight into the man's face. He was bleeding bad. Several big gashes on his body, and his clothes were shredded. Blood jetted from torn veins and arteries in breast, shoulder, and neck. The wounds were ghastly to see. Great ragged tears that were not made by bullet or knife. One ear had been torn plumb from his head and hung loose, with a great piece of flesh from the angle of his jaw and his neck, as if some gigantic beast had ripped it out with fangs. "What in the devil did this to you?" Jack exclaimed. "A bear?" Even as he spoke the words, he knew this was not the work of a bear. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was done by a wolf, but not any ordinary wolf. Jack jumped off his horse and grabbed his blanket that was rolled up on the back of his saddle to put around the man, but he knew he had no chance of surviving. He held the dying man until he had taken his final breath. Straining to see into the darkness, Jack made out a vague shape a few yards away in the trail. It was erect and as tall as a man, but it made no sound. He opened his mouth to call out, but no sound came. An indescribable chill flowed over him, freezing his voice. It was fear, primitive and unreasoning, fear at what lay ahead. Suddenly the figure moved quickly toward him, and Jack found his voice. "Stay back," he said. No answer, but the form came on in a rush. As Jack reached for his pistol, it was almost upon him. With a ferocious snarl, the figure hurled himself against him and felt a sharp pain on the side of his neck. His gun exploded almost involuntarily and without aim. Then with a crashing rush through the trees, the assailant was gone. Now blood was trickling down Jack's shoulder, soaking through his shirt. He knew it was a warning, that if the beast had wanted to, it could have taken him right there and then, as he kneeled over the dead man. No, this was merely a warning, a game of cat and mouse. Should he risk his life further by continuing up the trail, or should he return back to Port Angeles and wait for Parker? Maybe bring in more men and dogs. At any rate, he couldn't leave the dead man laying there. If Hans didn't come back for him, surely any number of other animals would find him an easy meal. Now, Jack did not waste much time in indecision. He had set out to perform a task. As for his own danger, he was already more than halfway to the cabin. It would scarcely be more dangerous to advance than to retreat. And if he did turn back and escape from there alive, before he could rouse a posse, anything might happen in that isolated cabin under the black trees. So he wrapped the dead man's body up in the blanket, tied him across the horse, and he went on, gun in hand and nerves sharpened by the new peril. It is not a pleasant experience to walk along a black forest trail with only the stars glinting through the dense branches, and the knowledge that a ruthless murderer is lurking near, perhaps within arm's length, in the concealing darkness. Sweat beaded on his face and his hands, and several times his ears caught the rustle of leaves or the breaking of a twig. How could he know whether the sounds were the natural noises of the forest or the stealthy movements of the killer? He sighed with relief when he saw what must have been Doc Morris's cabin lights gleaming through the trees, but he did not relax his vigilance. If Hans had been there first, it could be a trap. Many a man has been struck down at the very threshold of safety. Knocking on the door, he stood back, gun drawn, peering into the shadows that ringed the tiny clearing that seemed to repel the faint light from the shuttered windows. "Who's there?" came a deep, harsh voice from within. "Doc, it's me, Jack Moore. Open the door." The upper half of the door swung inward, and Doc Morris's head and shoulders were framed in the opening. The light behind him had left most of his face in shadows, but could not obscure the harsh, gaunt lines of his features, nor the rifle that was pointed straight at Jack. "Whoa there," Jack said quickly. "It's me, Doc. You remember me, right?" Doc Morris hesitated for a second. Then a big grin came across his face. "It is you. What the hell are you doing all the way out here?" Well, the lower half of the door was unbolted and swung open, and Doc Morris stepped out and gave Jack Moore a big bear hug and handshake. "Damn, it's good to see you, old friend, but what brings you out here this time of night? You're a damn crazy man. I could have shot you." "I came out here to warn you. Gunther's son, Hans, is out of jail. Word has it that he's seeking revenge on the men who killed his mom and dad. He's coming this way, and he knows this forest. In fact," Jack pointed at the body slung over the back of his saddle, "I think this might be one of his victims." "What? You're carrying a dead man on the back of your horse?" He laughed and slapped his thigh with his big hand. "You are a sight for sore eyes, Jack. You haven't changed a bit." "Sit down," Jack said. "I'll tell you the whole story." Well, the next morning, Jack and Doc loaded the body, still wrapped in Jack's blanket, into Doc's truck. And leaving the horses in the barn, Doc drove the zigzag logging trail out to the road. Jack thought to himself, no wonder there's no GPS coordinates to Doc's cabin. You get lost trying to find your way through this maze of trails. Well, the Clallam County Sheriff's Office was very interested in the body that was brought to them. "It's the third deceased this week with this kind of injury," the sheriff said. "There was a dead girl called in last week by a couple of hikers, and a bum up at Rialto Beach was found among the rocks a couple of days ago, and then we had a half-eaten body found along the Kalawa River." Jack proceeded to tell him about Hans Jaggers, but left out the truth about parents. He did mention that Hans had a vendetta against several men who had investigated the hunting accident that killed both his parents. Now, Jack had every reason to believe that Hans was in this part of the country and was responsible for the mysterious deaths that have been occurring around the Olympic National Park. After giving the sheriff details of where they could be reached if necessary, the two men headed back to Doc's cabin. "What are we going to do, Jack?" Doc asked his friend. "There's already a media storm brewing about those other deaths. Tourists are going to be heading up here by the carloads, looking for werewolves and vampires and the Cullens. That movie made this whole area a haven for those kinds of groupies, and we got the Bigfoot hunters out here as well. Hell, this place will be swarming in another day or two." Jack just shook his head, because he didn't have a clue what they were going to do. Well, the next morning, Jack and Doc loaded up their gear and saddled their horses. They figured they'd scout for tracks and try to get a handle on where Hans was bedding down. They knew he'd hunt at night, so they felt fairly safe searching for him during daylight hours. They also wanted to get a good idea how many other people were nearby. So when they were hunting the wolf creatures in Montana, they were able to contain their search area simply because they knew their surroundings, and it was all private ranch land. Here they were in a whole different situation. There were tourists, there were backpackers, hikers, there were campers and families with young children in the forest. The only advantage they had this time is they know who they were up against. So they had traveled about 6 miles by horseback on a trail which led through a thickly forested canopy with even thicker undergrowth of ferns and moss and abundance of mushrooms. Little creeks ran through the forest floor like branches on a tree. The trails were pretty well maintained by park rangers and the constant foot traffic of hikers. There were a few campgrounds in the area and some Forest Service cabins. The sheriff didn't want them scaring the tourists and had asked them not to say anything, just to let them handle it. Well, they had issued a statement along with a photograph of the wanted man, Hans Jaeger, to all the park rangers and asked them to be on lookout for just anything strange. So Doc had made friends with a few of the rangers in the area and had asked him to keep him abreast of any new attacks on people or animals. And the Quinault tribe still had hunting rights on their land, and there was plenty of elk. In the fall, the salmon run were plentiful, and that brought the black bear. The Olympic National Park is a pristine and undisturbed ecosystem, but there is one predator you won't find there. Wolves remain the only wildlife species that you won't find anywhere in the park. Wolves have slowly been reestablishing packs throughout eastern Washington and the northern Cascades, but as of yet, no reported sightings have been made within the park boundaries. So if anyone did report seeing a wolf, chances are it would be Hans. The popular movie and the book Twilight that brought so much attention to this area, it led folks to believe that this part of the Pacific Northwest was full of vampires and werewolves. Vampires liked the rainy, wet weather as they needed to stay out of the sun. But the werewolves were supposedly members of the native people who turned into werewolves to protect their people from the vampires. Some of the locals thought it was fun to hook up speakers in the forest around their homes and play wolf howls. It was a way to cash in on the tourist trade and bring more people to their businesses in town. It was late afternoon when Jack and Doc headed back to the cabin. It had been a nice ride and the horses had gotten some good exercise. They had a pretty good idea what they were up against and decided it was best to wait for Parker to arrive, and then they'd come up with a plan. Returning to the cabin, there was a note pinned to the front door from one of Doc's neighbors who worked for the Forest Service. "Hey, Doc, heard there's some trouble down near the old Kestner homestead. Heard there was a big wolf sighted. Brought down an elk, and a camper has disappeared down at Queets. Kathleen made you a cherry pie, stuck it in your fridge. Bill." Well, Jack and Doc fed the horses, and they put them in the barn for the night. Then they settled in for some of Kathleen's famous cherry pie. They'd head out to check the homestead in the morning. Now, at the southwest corner of the park boundary, about 20 miles from Doc's cabin, they drove to the old Kestner homestead. The Kestners had tried to carve out a life for themselves by farming this portion of the rainforest, but they'd failed. It wasn't for the lack of effort or lack of water. In fact, There was too much water. The family just couldn't beat back the rapid encroachment of the rainforest. Their orchards and their crops flooded, and try as they might, they just couldn't make a go of it. The Park Service had eventually purchased the land from them, but there were still a few old buildings remaining and traces of the old farm. So they got out and they looked around. Someone had definitely been hanging around there. They could tell by a few items left in the old shed. A sleeping bag and a few articles of clothing. They could be from a drifter, sure, but they also might be Hans's things. They didn't know if Hans was traveling as a man or a wolf. It didn't require a full moon to bring on his abnormality. That was merely part of the legend. He could change at will. How that worked, they didn't know, but one thing was for certain. He could appear as a man if he wanted to, but the beast was always lurking within him. Now up the road was a small rustic campground on the Queese River that Bill had mentioned in his note. It's secluded and wild and known for its black bear, but this wasn't a bear that mauled the camper. Jack and Doc were certain of that. They drove on up to the campground to investigate the surroundings up there. Doc's old pickup pulled up to the campsite where they met the sheriff who'd arrived sometime earlier. The sheriff had been trying to calm down a very distraught backpacker, and he wasn't having much success. The man's frantic fear seemed to border on insanity. He couldn't catch his breath or make any sensible statements. Well, Jack took a look inside the man's tent and saw 2 sleeping bags. He glanced around, didn't see anyone else nearby. "You here alone?" Jack asked the camper. The man nodded his head back and forth in a distinct no, and tried to say something. "Just calm down, take a deep breath. We're all here to help you. Let's start from the beginning." Then Doc took a flask of whiskey out of his truck and offered the man a drink, which he gladly accepted. It seemed to calm him, just enough to get a couple of deep breaths. Finally able to speak, the man began his story. His wife and he had backpacked down the Queets River Road, which had been washed out for years, so it was unpassable by vehicles, and they walked that down to the campground. She'd left the campsite to pick wild blackberries. He heard her scream, and he jumped up to run towards her. Well, he reached the blackberry thicket, but his wife's screams were fading into the distance. Something had grabbed her and ran. He had tried to follow, but he couldn't make his way through the thick underbrush, the thorny thicket. He thought he saw a wolf, but it couldn't have been a wolf because it ran on 2 legs. Well, his wife's screams continued till he couldn't hear him any longer. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't get cell reception. He didn't have a vehicle. So he took off running up the river loop trail, and he met a park ranger who was able to radio in for help. Now, the sheriff assured the man they'd do everything they could to find his wife, and there was no sense in staying there alone at the campground. They offered to take him into town and put him up in a hotel until further investigation could take place. Jack and Doc looked at each other and shook their heads. How could they possibly hunt this creature when he could be anywhere on the Olympic Peninsula? Well, so they drove back home in silence, both men searching their thoughts for the best way to hunt down this predator. Parker arrived in Port Angeles the following day, and Jack and Doc were there to greet him. The 3 sat in a diner, and they all discussed a plan of action. They knew Hans would ultimately find them, which might be easier than trying to track him through the thick forest. He could be anywhere, and they knew he could travel through that dense underbrush much easier than they could. Well, they decided the best plan would be to hold up at Doc's cabin and wait for him to come to them. So they bought provisions to last several days and stopped in at the sheriff's office to introduce Parker and inform him of their plan. Best to keep the local sheriff's department on their side just in case things got ugly and they needed him. Well, 4 days had passed before they had a sign. It was evening, and the horses were restless. Doc's dog, an old Queensland heeler named Bessie, she'd been barking and perking her ears up all evening. Something was bothering her. The horses were sheltered in the barn, and they kept Bessie inside, even though she wasn't any too happy about that. The 3 men had loaded rifles, and they'd check them ever so often. They had bolted the door, and they all took their positions at the windows. From the black woods surrounding the cabin there rose a shriek, a blood-curdling laughter, followed by the distinct howl of a wolf. "He's here," Jack said, as much to himself as if to the others. "Watch those trees. If anything moves, shoot first and ask questions later. I'll do the same on this side. Let's get us a wolf." The men watched through the open windows of the cabin on the 3 sides that had windows. The back of the cabin had a door that was bolted shut, but no windows, and Doc stood beside the living room window and was flanked by the kitchen, with Jack Moore standing at that window, and a small bedroom where Parker stood guard. But even as Doc peered into the darkness of the night forest, seeing no movement at all, the top portion of the window pane above him was shattered, as if something had been hurled through it. Instantly the night was split by sheets of flame that burst in blinding flash out of the doors and the windows and chimney of the cabin. Tongues of flame leapt to the walls and ceilings of the small cabin. In a chaotic dance of terror, the men ran, rolling in the dirt to extinguish the flames from their clothing, while scanning the darkness for the beast. Shots rang out, and there was yelling and screaming. Even while the blaze was still in his eyes, another explosion filled the night with blinding sparks and accompanied by a thunderous reverberation, and Jack fell, struck on the head from behind, terrifically and without warning. A flickering light from a torch was the first thing he saw upon awakening. Jack blinked. He shook his head. He came suddenly full awake. He was lying on his back in a small glade, walled by towering black trees which reflected the light that emanated from a torch stuck upright in the earth near him. His head throbbed and blood was clotted on his scalp. His clothes were torn and his skin was scratched as if he'd been dragged brutally through the brush. A huge, dark shape squatted over him. A man of medium height, but of gigantic breadth and thickness. A man, not quite wolf, but not quite human either. Hans Jaeger. His beastly ferocity was reflected in the bulging knots of muscles that corded his long, massive, hairy arms, his huge, sloping shoulders, and the massive head with long, canine fang teeth. Yet he still had the slim hips and lower torso of a man. "About time you were coming to, Jack Moore." The beast spoke in a low, guttural voice. "I wanted you awake before I kill you, so you know who killed you." "Where's Doc?" Jack demanded harshly. "And Parker?" "Oh, don't you worry. You'll watch him die as well," the beast snarled, showing his fangs in a slobbery, evil sneer. "You can watch me tear out his throat. The other man, he's already dead." Hans was a wild beast, but Jack had been a fighter in his youth, and he knew his life depended on getting the upper hand. Jack met him at his own game. He fought the wolf as a wild beast would fight, as savages fight, as bull apes fight, beast to beast, muscle straining against muscle, iron fist crushing against hard skull, knee driven to the groin, teeth slashing sinewy flesh, gouging, tearing, smashing. Man and beast were aware of only one desire, one blind urge to kill with naked hands, to rend and tear and maul and trample until the other was a motionless mass of bloody flesh and splintered bone. He didn't know how long they'd fought. Time faded into a bloodshot eternity. His fingers were like iron talons that tore the flesh and bruised the bone underneath. His head was swimming from its impacts against the hard ground, and from the pain in his side where he knew he had suffered a huge gash from the beast's mighty claws. His garments hung in ribbons, wrenched by the blood that poured from his wounds. But Jack was a fighter, and Bessie was too. The Queensland had fought with all her might, tearing and biting and ripping away flesh from the beast's back and his neck, barking and adding to the commotion, giving Jack a slight advantage. The torch had been knocked down and kicked aside, but it still smoldered fitfully, and Jack was just able to reach it with his outstretched arms. He flung it into the beast's face, scorching his eyes and singeing his hair. In a red haze, Jack saw the beast's great white fangs bite into his shoulder. Writhing half free from his rending clutch, he drove every straining knot of muscle in his body and smashed his fists in the beast's jaw. There was a crack of bone, an involuntary groan, blood spurted and the broken jaw dropped. A bloody froth covered his loose lips. Then for the first time the beast faltered. There was a gunshot, and then another, and then the beast collapsed on top of Jack. Parker had not been dragged far. Thinking he was dead, the beast had merely hauled him off the trail into the deeper woods and left him there. His throat ripped, but not fatally. He was able to use the shreds of his shirt to tie around his neck to staunch the bleeding. He found his pistol lying nearby and had dealt the final blow that would bring the wolf down. Now Doc, lying unconscious in the clearing where the cabin was burning, he was not badly hurt. He had a few burns, but he'd recover. The second explosion had knocked him off his feet and his head hit a rock, knocking him unconscious. But he'd survive his injuries. Now the cabinet was gone, but he still had Bessie, and the men had done what they'd set out to do. They had killed the beast. Jack spent a few weeks in the Seattle hospital, his wounds mending from the wolf attack. His shoulder would take a while to heal, but Doc and Parker stopped by the hospital to see him regularly. He slept fitfully, the infection from the bites raging through his body and bringing all manner of curious dreams. It brought on nightmares, dreams where he was running, always trying to escape his tormentors. He passed in and out of consciousness. In the moments he was awake, he wondered and worried, now that he had been bitten by the wolf, what might happen to him? Was it true what they said about werewolves? Becoming the wolf. Kat Moore poured another cup of coffee and handed it to Jack. She was glad to have her brother home, glad to have him alive. He'd been in some rough scrapes, but this one just about did him in. He hadn't talked much about his trip to Washington, and he hadn't even told her how he'd ended up in Seattle at the University of Washington Medical Center. Though he didn't want to talk about it, she was sure she could coax it out of him eventually. See, Kat and Jack had been close since they were kids. Inseparable, in fact. Jack was 5 years older and had always protected his little sister from every bit of harm that ever came her way. There were a few years when they were teenagers that his overprotectiveness annoyed her. Jack was always chasing away the boys that wanted to date Kat. See, he figured no guy was good enough for his sister, and if they didn't meet his approval, well, they didn't stand a chance at winning her hand. Maybe that's why she never married. In her eyes, no man could ever measure up to the man her brother was. And as adults, they'd remained close. Jack had moved to Montana, and he'd become a brand inspector and had a cattle ranch. And Kat had followed her dreams of attending the Eindhoven Design Academy in the Netherlands. She lived abroad for several years, but had recently come back stateside and bought a house in Telluride, Colorado, where she planned on opening an art studio. It would be nice to have Jack around to help set up that new studio space. Well, Jack had been in the hospital for a couple of months, suffering from a terrible infection caused from a wound to his shoulder, and had been attacked by a wild animal. This much she'd gathered from the nurse when she'd flown to Seattle to be with him. His good friends Doc Morris and Bert Parker had been checking in on him regularly. They'd been injured as well, but they weren't about to tell Kat anything about it. Well, that's up to your brother, not us, was all she could get out of him. Now, once Kat arrived, Parker had flown back to his ranch in Wyoming, and Doc lived near the coast in Washington, about 5 hours away, so he still checked in regularly. But no amount of sweet-talking could open him up about Jack's injuries. Cat would just have to wait. Now, once Jack was well enough to be discharged, he and Cat flew to Denver, and then they rented a car for the drive home to Telluride, and it was an incredibly beautiful 6-hour drive. Cat brought the conversation around to the events leading up to the hospital stay, but Jack would always just change the subject. Finally, after several attempts, he said firmly, "Cat, some things are better left unsaid. You just have to believe me on this." Well, the rest of the drive, Cat kept the conversation light. She kept telling Jack all about her plans for the art studio and the new house. Along the way, they stopped in Montrose to pick up building supplies and paint, and then they headed on their way. It was nightfall by the time that they arrived. Jack spent the next couple of days sleeping fitfully, and Cat noticed that he often cried out in his sleep. It was eating her up that she didn't know what she could do to help him or what had happened to him. She hoped that with time he'd open up about it. Old Jack's nightmares had gotten so bad, so real, that he dreaded going to sleep. Well, the narcotics that they gave him helped a little bit. His doctor had prescribed some strong sleeping pills, but they knocked him out for several hours. But as they wore off, the dreams would start up. And in the dreams, he was always running through thick forest like a dog or a wolf. His hearing was exceptional. He could hear the faintest rustle of leaves. His sense of smell was capable of detecting scents from miles away. And his eyes saw things differently. He hoped that these strange dreams were caused from the combination of the drugs he'd been given in the hospital and the stress he'd put his body through fighting this beast. He hoped and he prayed it was not a reaction to the bite that he'd received in his shoulder. It had caused an extreme infection that his body was still fighting. Of that he knew for certain. But there was still an underlying fear that the infection would lead to a transformation of his body into something Jack did not want to admit, even to himself. Jack appreciated the distraction that Cat's new project provided him. He was able to direct the crew that she'd hired to build her displays and help her pick out track lighting. Now, they made a few trips to Montrose and Grand Junction for supplies that they couldn't find locally, and he was beginning to feel like normal. That was a good feeling, normal. Well, before he left his ranch in Montana, he'd hired a couple extra cowboys to manage things in his absence. Originally, he thought he'd only be gone about a week or two, and now it was going to be 3 months. And much to Cat's disappointment, he made arrangements to drive back to Montana and check on his ranch. He had complete confidence in the fellers he'd hired, and he'd been in contact with them on a pretty regular basis, but he'd been gone from home for too long, and it was time to get his life back to normal. There was that word again, normal. Jack chuckled to himself. He'd be happy if the rest of his life centered on the meaning of that one 6-letter word. Cat begged him to tell her what had happened before he left, but Jack just shook his head. "Cat, just let it rest." And he kissed the top of her head and tipped his cowboy hat to her and climbed in his truck, and he headed north through Wyoming and on up into Montana. Now, Jack ran about 200 mother cows on his 3,000-acre ranch, and that's 3,000 acres deeded, and they used the Forest Service in the summer. It was a big spread, and he was an old-school cowboy. His guys worked the herd on horseback, no side-by-sides or quads on his range. He liked to sit a saddle. When the sun rose in the morning, he'd saddle his horse and set out to check on the herd, making sure they had enough water and forage. The crisp morning air was filled with the aroma of sagebrush, and he enjoyed listening to the distant lowing of his cattle. It was demanding work, but it was a life deeply connected to the land and its rhythms, and in the evening there was nothing better than sitting around a campfire and sharing stories with the hired hands. It was a perfect life in Jack's mind. Well, Jack had been back a week when the Garrison brothers pulled up one afternoon. They'd been part of the original hunt for the wolf creature several years ago, and knew Jack had been out there in Seattle with Doc Morris and Bert Parker. And like Cat, they were curious about what had happened out there in Washington. Why, they had heard that Hans Jaeger had been killed, mauled by a bear, the newspapers had reported. They had tried to get Parker to tell them the story, but he was as tight-lipped as Jack was. Well, the Garrison brothers obviously thought that a couple shots of whiskey around the campfire might just loosen up Jack's tongue. Now, what's the big secret anyway? Hank Garrison asked. We already know the truth about the Jaggers, so why all the hush up about it? And Jack just rubbed his aching shoulder and sat in his own silence. The pain and the stiffness never went away, and it had become a habit of his to rub his arm and his shoulder whenever he thought about that night. Over the weeks that followed, the routine of ranch life was comforting, and Jack began to feel as if the entire event had all been a bad dream. He still had nightmares, but they were less frequent, and he didn't feel as troubled by them anymore. He noticed his senses were sharpened, but he figured that that was to be expected now that his body had eliminated all traces of the drugs that he'd been taking to get him to sleep. His appetite was enormous, however. He figured he'd put on a few pounds, but the bathroom scale didn't show any change at all. He just couldn't seem to satisfy his hunger. He'd taken to cooking a nice big steak every night on the grill. The rarer the better. He had an endless supply right there on the ranch. Meat was plentiful, and those steaks were damn good. And a month after Jack returned, he was out in the far corner of the property checking fence. He came across a dead calf. Now that happens sometimes. A lion or a bear gets one down and kills it, but normally they'll carry away the prey. And he got off his horse to investigate it and look for tracks. As he leaned over that dead calf, he felt something stir inside of him. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, and it made him very uncomfortable. He could feel a little saliva build up in his mouth, and his senses got real sharp. He could smell the blood on that young calf and had an overwhelming urge to taste it. He quickly got back on his horse and he just rode away from it. He left that dead calf to the buzzards or the coyotes or whatever else might want it. He needed to put as much distance between himself and that dead calf as possible. For the next several days, Jack couldn't get the thought out of his mind that he actually had felt something happen to him, a change of some kind, when he saw that calf laying there. The dreams had come back in full force now, and always in the dreams he was running, and he was a wolf. He would wake drenched in a cold sweat, his nerves on edge and his heart pounding in his chest. It had been over a month since he'd returned, and he still hadn't heard from Bert Parker. Parker, had been the sheriff in these parts for many years, but he was now retired and had time to just enjoy ranching. Jack had left him several phone messages and was surprised that Parker hadn't returned any of his calls. They'd been good friends for years, and Parker was the one leading the original wolf hunt when they discovered the truth about the Jaggers, and he was the one Jack had called in to help up at Doc Morris's place in Washington with the Jaggers' son. Hell, he's the one who saved my life, Jack thought to himself as he dialed the phone again, leaving another message on the answer machine. Parker was the one who dealt the final blow by firing several shots into that beast that was attacking Jack back in Washington. He'd lifted that dead half-wolf, half-man off of Jack right before Jack had slipped out of consciousness. He was more than likely the one that got Jack and Doc to the hospital. He'd been injured himself. Jack remembered that Parker had his throat ripped open and had just barely escaped death himself. So why wouldn't he return his calls? He tried Doc Morris's phone again, but he knew that Doc didn't have cell service way back there in the woods. But he left a message anyway. He felt alone and he felt scared. He didn't know if he was going crazy, imagining these changes in his body, or if they were real, and he damn sure didn't want to talk to anybody else about it. Those two men were the only two he trusted, and he wasn't so sure he could trust them either. As he rode the range that morning, he made up his mind that he would drive the 60 miles out to Parker's ranch. He'd leave the next day, let his men know he'd likely be gone for a couple of days, and he'd find out what was going on with Parker one way or another. And if he couldn't find Parker, then he'd drive out to Washington and he'd find Doc. Now, the Parker Ranch was on a beautiful stretch of land under the shadows of the majestic Tetons in northwestern Wyoming. He raised over 100 head of elk for sport hunting and for the meat and the velvet, Now Jack drove up to the large log ranch home and he saw Parker's pickup in the side yard by the barn, half loaded with hay. Parker's dogs greeted Jack's truck as he pulled up in the front of the house. There was no sign of Parker. Rather than walk up to the main house, he headed straight towards the barn, hoping to find Parker there. And the man he knew as Parker had been tall, lean, and muscular. Parker had been the sheriff for many years and always kept himself physically fit. But the man who greeted Jack was a mere shadow of his former self. In the few months since he had seen him, Parker had grown extremely thin and pale, almost skeletal. Jack reached out his hand to shake Parker's and felt a hand that was mostly skin and bone. The look of concern on Jack's face could not be hidden. Parker's eyes darted back and forth like he wanted to run and hide from the companion he had known for years. Jack clasped his hand and put the other hand on the man's shoulder. "Parker, what is it, man? What's happened to you?" Jack asked. Parker sighed and he asked Jack to come with him into the house. June, that's Parker's wife, greeted him at the door, and the look she gave Jack was one of concern. She gave Jack a hug and told him it was good to see him again. She then excused herself to the kitchen to make some fresh coffee. Parker motioned for Jack to sit in one of the big armchairs in the living room, and then he sat himself in the other, showing considerable unease as he sat back in the chair. "I'm sorry I didn't answer your calls. I didn't want you to see me like this, you see. I haven't wanted to talk to anyone, nor see anyone. I just want to be left alone. I'm dying, Jack," he said with a deep sigh. "What is it?" Jack asked. "Is it cancer?" Now, it took a few moments for Parker to answer. Then in a soft, barely audible voice, he said, "No, it's the infection. When that beast tore into my throat, he left behind some kind of bacteria. It's been eating away at me. I can't stomach any food, can't keep anything down. The doctors have tried everything they can think of to counteract this poison that's eroding my insides, but it's like some big mystery. It's like my body is cannibalizing itself. It's the damnedest thing. Most days, it's all I can do just to get out of bed. June's scared to death she's going to lose me, and honestly, Jack, I think she's right to be scared. I don't know how much longer I got." Jack stayed on a couple extra days to help June around the house, and he arranged for some hired help to come in and feed the elk and manage things around the ranch. Now, he assured June that he'd be back shortly. Then he drove to Jackson Hole to catch on an airplane for Seattle. Seeing the state that Parker was in made him worry about Doc as well. Parker hadn't heard from Doc since he'd left Seattle, and neither had Jack. The flight was uneventful, but once Jack landed in Seattle, the moist weather seemed to bring on that aching in his shoulder, something fierce. He rented a truck and he drove the 4 hours to Port Angeles. He'd left several messages for Doc, but they weren't returned. He'd hired a couple of fellows from Forks to drive out to the property ahead of him, but he hadn't heard back from them either. Damn cell phone reception, he thought to himself as he headed down that windy dirt logging trails to Doc's very secluded property, where he had lived in a small log cabin. Well, the main cabin had been badly burnt, but there were several outbuildings and sheds on the property, and he knew Doc would be settled in one of those while he rebuilt the cabin. It was almost nightfall by the time he reached the compound. The memories of the past events haunted him now that he was back here in the forest. Memories of the night he'd ridden on horseback through these dark woods seeing Doc's cabin. Memories of the dead man, the attacks and the deaths that followed, leading up to the final night when Hans Jaeger had almost killed him. The half-man, half-wolf beast had almost taken his life, and now would be the cause of Parker's death as well. Doc answered his "Hello there" in the same way he had done when Jack first found him out here in the woods, with a rifle pointed squarely at his head. "Whoa there, Doc, it's me, Jack." He expected the same gruff welcome he'd experienced before, but this time it was different. There was an unexpected, suspicious reply from Doc this time. "What do you want?" Jack, he was taken aback. This wasn't the usual jovial, good-natured Doc at the door. "Doc, I came to talk to you about Parker. He's not well. I've tried to reach you numerous times, but you never return my calls, and I need to know if you're okay. And that's why I'm here, halfway across the country, at your doorstep. Now please let me in and let me know if you're okay." Jack spoke from the walkway leading up to the small shed that Doc was now living in. Well, Doc peered through the edge of the doorway, but he didn't step out. The rifle didn't come down. Doc said in a low, gravelly voice, "You just step away from here, Jack. I don't want any trouble, and I don't want to shoot you. You just get back in your truck and you drive away, and you don't ever come back here. You hear me?" That was not what Jack was expecting to hear. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He tried to explain himself, but the shed door closed and Jack could hear the bolt latch in place. Jack just stood there not knowing what to do. Part of him was angry. Part of him was hurt. He'd come all this way just to be turned away. What the hell just happened to the man he had known for years? His friend. Parker was dying, Doc was ambivalent, and he admitted himself that he was changing into something he didn't want to admit. None of this made any sense at all. Well, Jack got back into his pickup and headed out. What else could he do? He decided to spend the night at a hotel in Port Angeles and drive back out early in the morning. Maybe in the light of day things would look different. Maybe Doc had been drinking and wasn't entirely himself. He began to feel a little better with anticipation of a different welcoming in the following day. Well, at daybreak, Jack grabbed a cup of coffee and headed back to Doc's. He'd had terrible dreams all night, brought on, he supposed, by his proximity to the location where the attack had occurred. He was anxious to get to the compound and just to see if Doc had a change of heart. Last night had been so strange. He just couldn't wrap his head around the way Doc had looked at him as if he'd been some kind of monster. Maybe that was it. Maybe Doc thought Jack was now a werewolf. But what would make him think that? Well, it was mid-morning when Jack arrived back at the cabin, and much to his dismay, the whole place was empty. No sign of Doc anywhere. The shed doors were locked, and Jack walked around the property. There was no sign of Doc. The pickup was gone. He didn't know whether to hang around or to leave. There was no way of knowing when Doc would return. He felt unbelievably frustrated, and he didn't know whether to be angry or concerned. After an hour of pacing around, he jumped back into his pickup truck and decided he'd head back to Port Angeles. To hell with him, he thought. I'm heading back to my ranch. He hadn't driven 10 miles before he stopped. The skin on the back of his neck was just sticking up and prickling. Had he heard something? Had he sensed something? He really wasn't sure, but he pulled that truck over to the side of the road and he killed the ignition. Something didn't feel right. There was an uneasy stirring in the air, and there was a real silence. No bird sounds, no little creatures scampering around under the brush, no insects making noises. It was as if the entire forest had just stopped breathing. He pulled his pistol out of its holster under the seat and quietly opened the truck door. Stepping out to the side of the truck. Was it his imagination, or did he just see a flash of something in the corner of his vision? He couldn't get over the feeling that he was being watched. Something was out there, and his senses were now razor sharp. He could hear every twig snap, every leaf rustling. His nose began picking up scents, and he found he could distinguish between the earthiness of the soil and the mustiness of the fallen leaves, the freshness of the air, and the undistinguishable scent of death and decay. He watched and he waited for several minutes, but he saw and he heard nothing else. So figuring it was his imagination and uneasiness of the whole Doc situation, he got back in his truck and he started driving on up the road. Oh, less than a mile later on, he came across Doc's truck, parked in the road. He stopped and he pulled off to the side and got out of the truck, pistol in hand. The inside of Doc's cab was empty, but he could see traces of blood on the steering wheel. He could smell the rank odor of death. Either Doc was hurt real bad or he'd recently killed something. He thought about waiting there, knowing that eventually he'd return to his truck, but he wasn't sure if he wanted Doc to see him there. So he got back into his truck and drove several hundred yards ahead and around the bend and left his truck parked there, circling back on foot to gain a vantage point to the truck. He sat there for what felt like an eternity before a rustle in the leaves caught his attention. He held perfectly still. He had spent many years hunting, and he knew how to be silent in the woods. He watched and he waited while the rustle in the leaves came closer. Out of the tree line stepped Doc Morris, dressed in jeans but bare-chested. Now, Doc was a big, burly man, but this version of Doc was absolutely enormous. His chest and his arms had muscles like a weightlifter, and he was covered with light, curly hair. His head was abnormally large for his body, and it too was covered in the same curly hair. But as he got closer to his truck, Jack could see his face. It was no longer the face of his friend, it was the hairy face of a wolf. Jack didn't know that Doc had been bitten, but this was proof that the legend was true. And what did this mean for him? He'd felt the changes in his appetite, the increased strength, his sharpened ability to hear and smell, and what about Doc? Should he confront him? Should he stay hidden and hope he hadn't noticed him? Or smelled him? Should he run? Now there wasn't time for a decision. Doc had picked up his scent. "Doc, stop! It's me, Jack," he yelled as that beast ran straight for him. Doc's lips curled back, showing massive fangs. Jack held his pistol aimed at the approaching man, and just before impact he pulled the trigger, but he was aiming for the beast's legs. He wanted to slow him down, not kill him. I mean, this was his friend. Or was it? Had the transformation been so complete that the good-natured Doc no longer existed inside this killing machine? Does a wolf feel remorse for his prey? Or kinship? Well, the bullet tore into the beast's flesh and he stumbled, but he quickly recovered. It barely slowed him down. He let out a blood-curdling howl and he ran off into the forest, leaving Jack standing there, unharmed, but vulnerable. It was a game of cat and mouse, and he was now the prey. He ran to his truck. He was watching the forest all around him for movement, and constantly turning to check if he was being followed. He jumped into the truck and he locked the doors. He started the ignition, spinning his tires as he fled. Back in his hotel room, he tried to make sense of it all. He didn't know what to do. Finally, he made a phone call to the local sheriff and he asked him to meet him for a cup of coffee at the diner. The sheriff remembered him from the previous visit and was glad to see Jack had recovered from his wounds. The sheriff knew something had occurred back at Doc's cabin the night Hans Jaeger had been killed, but he'd been willing to accept the story about the bear mauling only because nothing else made any sense. The word werewolf was never mentioned. Well, the sheriff told Jack there had been recently several deaths in the park, and the two men that Jack had hired to check on the Doc were missing. This news confirmed Jack's suspicion. The Doc was now hunting for food, and maybe for sport. He couldn't tell the sheriff his suspicions without telling the whole story about the Jaggers, so he just left it unsaid. But he asked the sheriff to keep an eye out for the Doc. "He's just not himself right now, and I'm worried about that," was all he said to him. Later that night, Jack made a phone call to the Garrison brothers. "I need your help. I think I need to tell you something about what happened out here at Doc's place, and we need to come up with a plan." The brothers agreed to fly out to Seattle in the morning. Now, he checked his messages, and he had received several from Kat, checking on him. If he didn't call her back, she'd start looking for him, and sure as hell didn't want her out here in the midst of all this craziness. He wasn't sure if he'd end up like Doc himself, and above all else, he needed to keep her safe. So he called to tell her everything was just fine, and he was out in Washington again, checking in on Doc, and he'd be back home in Montana by the end of the week. She asked him to attend her grand opening of the studio, and he knew it really hurt her feelings if he didn't attend, so he assured her he'd be there. He hoped it wasn't a lie. Hank and Lance Garrison arrived in Seattle, and Jack picked them up at the airport. He filled them in the whole story on the drive out the coast, stopping in Tacoma to purchase guns and ammunition for their hunting trip. Jack chose not to tell them about his own concerns of transformation. He needed them to trust him, not to fear him. And he still wasn't sure if he was transforming. Certainly he was not in the same condition that Doc was in. Now, the Garrison brothers had never been to Washington, and they were amazed at the beauty of the Olympic Peninsula. It's really green, isn't it? Driving into the little town of Forks, they laughed at the sign that said, "No vampires allowed," and noted that the sign should actually read, "No werewolves allowed." Just past there was the dirt logging road, which serves as a fire break and leads the way back to Dog's cabin. Well, it was a sunny afternoon when they pulled into Doc's compound. His pickup was there, and so was the sheriff's truck. Not a good sign, thought Jack to himself. The men climbed out of Jack's truck and called out a "hello there." But they got no answer. They walked around the outbuilding. There was no sign of the Doc or the sheriff. The door to the shed where Doc was living was unlocked, so they opened the door and they looked inside, and it was a mess. It looked like a scuffle had taken place. Chairs were knocked over and the table had been overturned, and a lamp was lying on the floor broken. The men knew that something had gone down there. They went back to the truck for their rifles, and they headed out, circling the buildings and listening for sounds. Jack's very sharp hearing and sense of smell had picked up a trace, and he led the other two men down a game trail that led off into the forest. About 100 or so yards up the trail, they came across the body of the sheriff. His throat was ripped open, and his eyes were just staring blankly ahead. And there was no sign of his gun. From where he lay, they followed a trail of blood that led through the forest. They stopped occasionally and listened for sounds or any other movements. They heard nothing except the chirp of birds and little noises of squirrels and chipmunks. And the traces of blood left the trail and led the men through some thick underbrush, fallen mossy logs and bracken. They would notice a drop of blood on a leaf, but it was slow going, climbing over logs and going around bushes. At last they came to a small clearing, and lying there, in a tuft of meadow grass, lay the body of Doc Morris, the pistol still pointing at the roof of what had been his mouth, the top of his head a mass of blood and tissue. He was dead. Lance turned his head and vomited. His brother put his hand on Lance's shoulder. "Not much we can do here." Well, he did offer to stay with the body to keep the coyotes and the buzzards away, and told Lance to go stay with the body of the sheriff to do the same while Jack radioed in the call from the sheriff's truck. It was a solemn end to the afternoon, but the men were glad they hadn't needed to hunt Doc down. And Jack hoped that this really was the end. The Jaggers were dead. Doc was dead. Parker was dying. And the only one left who had been attacked was himself. Luckily, the Garrison brothers and the other men who had hunted down the Jaggers back in Montana had not actually had contact with the beast. They'd be safe from the effects and the changes that were occurring in him. At least he didn't have to worry about any of them transforming. Yeah, but would they actually be safe from him? Is this what he had to look forward to? As the men waited for the coroner and the deputies to arrive, Jack thought about his options. He could end his life like Doc had, or he could try to find a cure. Maybe if he researched what or who had changed the Jaggers, maybe he'd find a way to stop the curse. He thought about making a trip to the region the Jaggers had come from back in Germany. Maybe then he could source out the truth about this mystery that now haunted him. Taming the Wolf, Part 4 of the Wolfman Series. Well, the curated art installation at the Taming the Wild Art Gallery in Telluride, Colorado, it was a huge success. Couldn't have been more appropriate. Strange how Kat's life had always mirrored Jack's. Now, he was 5 years older than his sister, but they were as close as twins. Jack was struggling with his own version of the wild beast, and here Kat had curated an entire gallery showing of wolves. Jack chuckled at the irony as he walked through her grand opening display, looking at the paintings of the animal he feared he was becoming. 20 local artists displayed their work in this show, and several were Kat's own paintings. She walked up to him, 2 glasses of champagne in her hands, and handed one to her brother. "Now, I'm so glad you could attend. It means the world to me." And she reached up and gave her brother a kiss on the cheek. "You know I wouldn't miss it for the world," Jack replied. He asked her why'd she choose the wolf as the subject for her opening installment, and she just shrugged her shoulders. You'd laugh at me if I told you, but I believe it's my spirit animal. I feel like I have a wolf watching over me, protecting me. I know that sounds funny to you, she grinned. He rolled his eyes as she would expect him to, but secretly he chuckled, again, at the irony. If only she knew how true that statement really was. Now Jack was becoming a wolf. He could feel it in his muscles, in his blood. But he was a strong man of character, and he'd be damned if he'd let it get the best of him. Up to this point, he'd been able to control his wild impulses to hunt. He ran a cattle ranch in Montana. He had plenty of beef to eat. He controlled his appetite, and he kept his mind sound. Accepting the truth of what he was becoming played a big part in helping him keep control. That, and watching his friend Doc Morris succumb to the beast and take his own life because of it. Well, Jack had barely gotten through the details of dealing with his friend Doc's death, scheduling the cremation, putting his affairs in order, when he had to leave for Wyoming to attend the funeral of his other friend, Parker. Parker had died from the infection that coursed through his body after he was attacked. He hadn't been bitten, but the beast in his claws had nearly torn out his throat and ultimately had killed him. Now Jack was the only one left who had direct contact with the Jaggers. The other men who were in the original wolf hunting party, now they were lucky to have only witnessed the transformation. However, Jack knew that there could possibly be others out there. Others who had not been killed by Gunther, Hanna, or their son Hans, but merely wounded. If there were others, they'd have certainly transformed into werewolves. Of that he was certain. Now he was glad Kat was preoccupied with this new gallery. She'd stopped asking him about the events that led up to his injuries. It was best that way. He didn't want her to know. But now that he was planning a trip to Germany, he'd have to think of something to tell her. She'd want to know why he was going, and he'd have to give her a good reason. She'd be suspicious, that's for sure. He didn't like to lie to her, but just to come out and tell her he'd always wanted to visit there, or some other fool reason, he knew she wouldn't buy that for a second. Jack had not had a woman in his life for a long time. He'd been too busy. But Kat was always questioning him about dating and trying to set him up with her friends. Maybe he'd tell her he'd met someone in Germany. That was a stretch, but why else would he need to make a trip over there? He had no idea how long he'd be there. Maybe he'd tell her he was interested in raising some unique German livestock. Hell, he didn't know what to say. He was deep in thought when he spotted an unusual painting in the back of the gallery. It took his breath away. It was a painting of a creature, half man, half wolf, and it looked real enough to be a photograph. It was small, and he had to lean really close to read the inscription of the title and the artist on the small plaque underneath. Taming the Wolf was the title of the piece, painted by Catherine Moore. Jack's head started swimming. He felt dizzy, nauseated. How? And when? He jumped when he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kat. I see you've met my spirit guide, she said. Back home in Kat's living room, they sat up, sharing a bottle of wine and talking. And Jack wanted to know all about that painting, and Kat was curious why Jack was so interested. Remember when I was a little girl and I had that really bad fever, Kat said. Mom and Dad took me to the doctor, and he said I had scarlet fever. I was so sick. Well, Jack did remember. He'd sat at her bedside for days, worried that he was losing his little sister. He remembered praying every night that his sister would get better. Well, Kat continued her story. I was having these crazy fever dreams, drifting in and out of consciousness. In my dreams, I saw this beast. It was half man and half wolf. In my dream, I was running, scared for my life. I didn't know what I was running from. Maybe I was running from death itself. But this wolf man stepped in, protected me from whatever it was that was trying to get me. He held me in his giant furry arms and told me he'd always be there for me. Oh, after I got well again, I remembered having that dream, and I've thought of it many times throughout my life. when I was trying to come up with an idea for my grand opening exhibit. In fact, it was just after seeing you after your injury, I remembered that dream again and decided that that would be the theme of my exhibit." Jack just stared at her in amazement. He figured now was as good a time as any to bring up the subject of his upcoming trip. "I'm going to Germany, Kat. I'll be gone a while, maybe as much as a month." She didn't even question why he was going. Instead, she replied in an excited voice, "Germany? Great. Can you do some research for me? I want to find out more about werewolves. I don't know if it's this exhibit or what, but I'm super intrigued by them. If you have the time, I'd love it if you'd do some background investigation for me. I'd like to plan a follow-up exhibit to this one." Well, Jack just grinned at the irony of it all. "You bet, sis." He got up, kissed her on top of the head, and went off to bed. The direct flight from New York to Dusseldorf International Airport in the Rhine-Ruhr region was just over 10 hours. Jack had no clue where he was going, but Kat had given him a full itinerary and a guidebook of the area. She had done her research long before Jack had ever dreamed of making this trip. As he sat on the airplane, he read from the guidebook. Flipping through the pages, his eyes landed on a name that jumped off the page. It read, "For many Germans, emigration to North America was an inviting alternative to the trials of life in the old country. From the mid-17th into the present century, thousands of Germans migrated across the Atlantic. They capitalized on the chance to escape poverty and persecution and to own their own land. After 1650, Germans settled throughout the states of Pennsylvania, Texas, New York, Illinois, and California. Many also landed in Canada, settling primarily in Ontario or farther west on the rich land of the prairies. Among them was Johannes Jaeger, who landed in Pennsylvania in the year 1743. Now here was another entry that caught his eye. Jaeger is mostly an American surname, a phonetic transcription of the common German surname Jagger, meaning hunter. Huh, go figure, he chuckled to himself. Kat's obsession was beginning to make some sense, in a strange way. The half-man, half-wolf creatures she had seen in her dreams as a child had been what spurred her into attending art school in the Netherlands. She had spent time exploring the North Rhine, Westphalia region around the northern edge of the Rhenish Mountains in a little town called Bedburg. Kat had made arrangements for him to stay in a quaint inn in Bedburg, the site of the first known werewolf, Peter Stubbe. Peter was a confessed serial killer who was executed on October 31st, 1589, along with his daughter and his mistress. He was a German farmer who had been accused of being a werewolf, along with crimes of witchcraft and cannibalism. Peter Stubbe was born in the village of Epreth, near the town of Bedburg. He was a wealthy and well-respected farmer and a widower. Peter claimed that when he was 12 years old, the devil himself gave him the ability to transform into the likeness of a wolf, including the sharp teeth, a large body and paws, and he could transform himself at will. He confessed to killing goats, lambs, and sheep, as well as killing and eating 14 children, including his own son. But Stubbe was suspected of many other murders. Now, the townspeople believed the wolf was stalking and attacking people and livestock in the area. One farmer caught the wolf in a trap, which cut off his right forepaw. The wolf escaped, and it proved without a doubt that Peter Stubbe was indeed the wolf, as Peter was also missing his right hand. Then a few hunters decided to take their dogs and hunt the wolf. After days of hunting, they finally spotted it. The dogs chased and cornered the wolf, but when the hunters arrived, it was not an animal, but Peter Stubbe. He was arrested there and confessed to his crimes, elicited by various means of torture. Now, his execution has been described as one of the most brutal on record, the likes of which are too gruesome to even repeat. Many werewolves from centuries ago were in fact serial killers, and France had its fair share. In the 15 and 1600s, there were several Frenchmen who allegedly swore allegiance to the devil and claimed to have an ointment that turned them into wolves. After confessing to brutally murdering and eating several children, they were burned to death at the stake. And burning was thought to be one of the few ways to kill a werewolf. Now, Jack couldn't believe he was actually reading this stuff. Superstitious nonsense he would have said only a few years ago. Now, here he was, traveling to Germany to seek out information on these creatures, of which he was now becoming one. He still couldn't believe this was all happening. Well, the inn at Bedburg was charming, and would have appealed far more to Kat than it did Jack. He was more comfortable in a cowboy bunkhouse than a cutesy bed and breakfast. Scones and tea? You gotta be kidding me. Give me coffee with a shot of bourbon, Jack laughed. The jolly rotund innkeeper thought he was just the cutest cowboy she'd ever seen, and told him he was the only man she'd ever known that actually wore a cowboy hat. She took to calling him Cowboy Jack and made him flapjacks and sausage for breakfast when all the other guests got muesli. Kat had given him a long list of places to go, things to see, information to gather, and people to contact. Why, she'd been planning on making that trip herself before she left the Netherlands, but her relationship with her boyfriend had ended badly, and she just wanted to go back home to the States and start her life over. The dream of opening her own art gallery and studio could now become a reality, and those plans became more of a priority than the trip to exploring Germany's werewolf legends. He wished she were here, though. She would have loved exploring this area, and it would have been a fun adventure for the both of them. But in the forefront of Jack's mind was his main goal of being here, to find someone who could help him find a cure or a way to counteract the curse that he had been given. The Jaggers had originally come from this part of Germany, and he hoped that he might find a clue as to why they left here to go to Montana and ultimately ruin his life. He planned to take the train to Cologne and the following day and see if there were any of Gunther and Hannah's relatives still living there. With nothing more to do that afternoon, he decided to take the famous hiking trail called the Werewolf Trail. It takes the hiker on a path of 7 stations, following the life and death of the historical werewolf Peter Stubbe. Signboards described the history of the werewolf trials, similar to the witch trials. It sounded interesting, and a walk might just clear his head. The next morning he woke before his host could coerce him into another morning of flapjacks and sausages. She was already in the kitchen making coffee and was very disappointed that Jack would not be staying for breakfast. He was anxious to get on his way. Cologne was only a half an hour away by train. Finding the Jaeger family did not appear to be as easy as he thought. The German White Pages is available online in German only, and although he could type in Jaeger, he couldn't read the text that popped up with the address and the phone number. There were many, many entries, and he didn't know where to begin or what he'd say when he got on the phone. Hello there. I'm wondering if any of your relatives are werewolves? He laughed at how ridiculous that sounded. He just wanted to go home. Maybe he could just live with this curse. Maybe if he ignored it, it would go away. The ever-present gnawing hunger for meat told him otherwise. Across the coffee shop from where he sat, trying to make sense of the online phone book on his phone, he noticed a young woman staring at him from across the room. He smiled at her, and she picked up her cup of coffee and boldly came and sat at his table. "Are you from America?" she asked. "United States?" Jack replied that he was, and she gave him a great big smile. "Me too. I've been studying abroad for a year, and I'd like to stay longer. My visa is nearly expired, though, so I have to head home next week. My parents live in Nebraska, but my grandparents live here. My family's from this area. I'm German, but I really don't think of myself as German. I'll probably have to finish up school in Lincoln. Where do you live?" Jack chuckled. This girl had barely taken a breath in between all those words. "Well, I have a ranch in Montana. I'm just here on vacation." "Well, great. Let me show you around. I have nothing to do this afternoon. You're going to love the architecture around here, especially the castles. And I know the best deli in town. My grandparents own it. And there's lots of museums and, well, okay," Jack said hesitantly. He really wasn't looking for company, and he'd hoped to spend the day doing research. This almost felt like babysitting an overly talkative, extremely exuberant young cat when she was a freshman at college. "Oh, I guess I should ask your name," he laughed. "My name's Rebecca. Rebecca Jagger. But all of my friends call me Beck." Jack just shook his head and smiled. "Okay, Beck, let's go meet your grandparents. I'd love to have a good deli sandwich." Jaeger's Deli was every bit as interesting as Beck made it out to be. It had been in the family for generations, in that same location. They made all their own sausages. They made sauerkraut and condiments. The potato salad was the best Jack had ever tasted. Now, the Jaegers, they were a friendly, happy people, much like their granddaughter. They didn't think it strange at all that a middle-aged cowboy from Montana was being led on a tour of the city by their Rebecca. They were just as welcoming. They asked Jack to come to their home later that evening for dinner. Well, the tour of the city was great. Jack took pictures for Kat. Mostly he was interested in getting back to the Jaegers for dinner. He wasn't sure how he was going to approach the subject of werewolves and their family history, but he knew that somehow he must. The Jaegers' home was a large timber-frame farmhouse in the old German style, where the living quarters and the barn are under one roof, and Jack found the architecture just fascinating. The bottom portion of the house was wide, with stalls on both sides built for animals. See, there was pens for cows, sheep, pigs, all adjacent to the main building. Now, Ludolf Jaeger explained that it had been called a Low German house, and it was traditional in this area since the 1500s. His home had been built in 1680, and had always been in his family. Originally, the family lived with the animals, but in the early 1800s, the family home was built upstairs. Well, Gertrude called them in for dinner and put a spread that could have fed a family of 12. There were sausages and ham, followed by a pot roast stew and a beef roll. Rebecca delighted in telling him the German names for each one of the dishes. The Jaegers apparently had as strong a desire for meat as Jack did. Beck did not stop talking throughout the entire meal, and the Jaegers carried the conversation almost as much as she did. Jack didn't stand a chance against this bunch. He tried occasionally to lead the conversation toward their family history. He couldn't get a word in. After dinner, Gertrude poured each of them a glass of Jägermeister. Ludolf explained that it was a traditional drink in Germany, and the name literally meant master of the hunt. Finally getting a chance, Jack asked about the family name of Jaeger. He explained that he had known a family by that name back in Montana. Gertrude let out a small gasp, and Ludolf said, "I wondered if that was why you were here." He took a deep breath and asked Rebecca to go feed the animals and let them talk in private. And then he began his story. The Jaegers come from a long line of wolf hunters. My name, Ludolf Jaeger, literally translates to wolf hunter. In the early 1700s, our ancestor, Jacob Jagger, had two sons, Johannes and Stefan. The two boys were bitter enemies. Jacob would pit the two boys against each other and told them that the strongest of the two would inherit his farm, this farm. The weaker of the two would have to leave to find a life of his own away from here. Now, Stefan was older and stronger, but Johannes was crafty. They say he made a pact with the devil, who gave him the ability to turn into a wolf. Stefan and his brother took turns watching the sheep that were out to summer pasture. At night, they were rounded into a sheep pen, and whichever brother was in charge would sleep outdoors with the flock. Johannes planned to sneak into the sheep pen at night, pretending to be after the sheep, knowing that his brother would be there. His plan was to attack and kill his brother. Instead, Johannes went to the sheep pen that night as a wolf, but his brother was not there. Filled with an irresistible urge to eat meat, he killed a sheep and ate it. The next night, he did the same thing. Still his brother was not there. He killed another sheep and again ate that one. The third night, Jacob was very angry that his sheep were being attacked and blamed his two sons for not keeping an eye on them. He didn't know Stefan was actually down at the neighboring farm sleeping with the farmer's daughter, and Johannes was out hunting for prey in the woods. He went to the sheep pen, and not finding either boy there, he was ready to shoot whatever predator was attacking the sheep, and possibly his own two boys as well. So Johannes shows up in full wolf form, and the father shoots him in his right foreleg, and again in the butt. The wolf ran off howling and limping, and the next day he's home with pellets in his right arm and his butt. Now, during that time, the werewolf trials were in full swing, much like the witchcraft trials. The townspeople showed no mercy if they thought you were guilty. Rather than be burned at the stake, Johannes fled to the coast, where he boarded a ship and sailed to the United States. Stefan inherited the farm. The curse that Johannes brought to his family had lived on every generation since, and we have hunted our family members for generations. We are the wolf hunters, but we have family who are werewolves. Now let me ask you, Jack, how well did you know Gunther and Hannah Jaeger? Jack proceeded to tell them about what had occurred in Montana, and that they had a son, Hans, who had also been killed. He did not tell them that he had been bitten and was carrying the curse himself. He still wasn't comfortable letting anyone know that detail, but he had an idea that Ludolf was already suspicious. It was getting late. Ludolf thanked Jack for letting him know about their relatives back in the States and shook his hand. He went to his desk and wrote a name down on a piece of paper and handed it to Jack. Give this man a call. He might be able to help you. No more words were spoken, but there was a look in his eyes that told Jack that Ludolf knew the truth. Well, Jack had missed the late train for Bedburg, so Beck dropped him off at a hotel in downtown Cologne. Sitting in his room, he thought about the events of the day. How coincidental it was he had picked the one coffee shop in town where he would meet Beck, a distant cousin of Hans, and then to meet her grandparents. And the paper with a handwritten name inscribed. Was it divine providence? Did he have an angel looking out for him? Was he just damn lucky? For a man that didn't believe in anything supernatural, all of this was pretty hard to swallow. At first light, he was awake, anxious to make contact with the name Ludolf had given him. He'd had a bad night of dreams. They were getting vivid and all the more real. He dreamt he was running through a dark forest, his ears picking up the sounds of every creature moving in the underbrush. Little field mice scampered underneath. Frogs were croaking, and the night birds calling out, but he was looking for bigger prey. He saw a woman jogging, earbuds in her ear. Of course it didn't make sense. A woman jogging alone in the night on a dark wooded trail. But the feeling he had was beyond the desire for the taste of her blood. He sprung upon her and ripped her throat open so she couldn't scream. He tore into her body with his long fangs. He lifted his head and let out a mighty howl, blood dripping from his mouth. He woke, drenched in sweat, and ran to the bathroom and threw up. At 8 a.m. he made the call. Professor Luther picked it up on the first ring. I was expecting your call. Ludolf phoned me earlier. Can you meet for coffee? Professor Luther was an authority on werewolves. He had published several books on the subject and taught a class at the local university on werewolf lore. He was very excited to meet Jack. Apparently, Ludolf had told him Jack had the curse. He was astounded that Jack had been able to hold back the transformation as long as he had. He explained that most people, men, women, and children, are unable to resist the curse after being bitten. Most have gone through the transformation within a day or two after the initial bite. He explained what happens to the body on a cellular level, how the DNA of the wolf merges with the RNA of a human and changes it. Most people see actual physical signs of the transformation soon after being bitten. Things like abnormal hair growth, elongated fingernails, bone spurs at the top of their feet and hands, the tops of ears becoming more pointed and often with hair sprouting from the ridge. The head itself becomes larger, the forehead more pronounced, and the jawline starts to bud out. The change in the teeth is perceptible as well, with the canine incisors getting longer and sharper, like fangs. He explained that some people experience a complete transformation into a full-body form of a wolf, while others have partial transformation, usually just their upper torso and their head. While their lower torso, their hips and their legs, they still appear human. And still there are others who transform mentally into killers, but show very little outside physical transformation. Hitler, for example, Charles Manson, among others. Children who have been bitten often turn into serial killers. Some may even take the lives of their own families or friends or schoolmates. It is not something they can outgrow. And it is very interesting that it tends to run through generations of the same family, as if the RNA and the DNA leaves a trace in the unborn fetus. For example, a father or a mother who has the curse may have several children, but only one of them might have that trace protein. The RNA carries genetic information that is necessary for their cellular transformation, and it is random. The idea that a werewolf only transforms during a full moon that's really just a myth, he explained, brought on most likely due to the fact that animals are out during the full moon. There's more to prey upon. Wolves like to hunt at night, but there is more to it than that. Our bodies are mostly comprised of water, and studies have shown that there is a slight change to our body's chemistry during the moon's phases. The chemistry of the werewolf's blood grows stronger during the full moon. Have you noticed that you crave more meat during the days when the full moon is present? Jack had to think about that. The hunger for red meat was a constant daily craving. Was it stronger during the full moon? He really wasn't sure. Well, Professor Luther had spent his adult life studying the biochemistry of the blood of the infected. As a young man, he had encountered his first werewolf, his roommate and best friend at college. He noticed that the young guy would often leave his dorm room late at night, coming home with bloody clothes. He would shower, throw his clothes in the trash, and sleep through the entire next day. He also knew that several young women on campus had gone missing, and he feared that his friend was the killer. He considered reporting him to the authorities, but confronted him instead. Remorsefully, his friend told him the truth of the curse he had lived with since he was a child and had been bitten by a rabid dog. Luther took blood samples from his friend, hoping to analyze them and find a cure for his friend's affliction. Within days of confessing to his friend, he was shot and killed while in wolf form, stalking the campus. That was in 1960 and was the beginning of Professor Luther's obsession with the werewolf. The professor paused and stared into Jack's eyes. "I do believe," he said, "that I might have something that will help you. If you're willing to let me experiment on you, I may be able to cure you." He motioned for the bill, and Jack reached for his wallet to pay. The professor asked Jack to follow him to a German apothecary. There he purchased a very small bag of an herb called wolfsbane and a jar of raw, unprocessed honey. The professor explained that wolfsbane is also known as an aconite and comes with the monk's hood flower. It's highly toxic and can cause a slowing of the heart rate, which can be fatal, even in very small amounts. Its poison can also act through contact with the skin, particularly through open wounds. There's no known antidote. It is known as the queen of poisons, and just 5 milligrams, the weight of a sesame seed, can kill an adult. The professor explained that when mixed into a tincture and with the blood from a werewolf and taken once a day in the week prior to the full moon, it will kill the wolf, but not the man. "It's your only hope," the professor said as he shook Jack's hand. "Come back to see me 1 week before the full moon. I'll mix the tincture concoction for you." He handed the jar of honey to Jack. "Meanwhile, I want you to eat a large spoonful of this honey every night before you go to bed. Do not use a silver spoon. Metal changes the enzymes in honey and renders it practically useless. Use a wooden spoon, or plastic if you must. The enzymes in the honey will help you sleep and eliminate your nightmares." Jack thanked the professor and walked to the train station and returned to Bedburg. It was already late in the afternoon. He'd spent the entire day with Luther and he'd learned so much. A lot of the information he could share with Kat, and he was anxious to call her. He looked at his watch. Well, Germany was about 8 hours ahead of her in Colorado. He decided he'd wait till he got back to the inn to call her. During the short train ride to Bedburg, Jed thought about his day with the professor. Luther had seemed so academic about it all, but to Jack, it was very real. He could feel it growing stronger in him every day. He felt challenged by it, but fearful at the same time. He hoped his strength and character was strong enough to hold it at bay. He was aware that at any moment the wild, cannibalistic urge of the wolf might overpower him. Once widespread in Central Europe, wolves had almost been hunted to extinction by the 19th century, regarded as a danger to livestock, competitors for game, and a threat to people. But 20 or so years ago, these predators started to come back. Not through reintroduction, but by naturally migrating west from Poland. In the years since, they have managed to not only reestablish themselves in Germany, but to steadily strengthen their hold, increasing their population by 25% annually. Wolves can travel great distances to find new territories. Under German law, wolves are protected, just like many parts of the United States. In Montana, it was still legal to shoot a wolf, only if it was actively harassing your cattle and you could prove it. He thought about his buddy Don in Colorado. Don had a ranch in North Park, and he woke up one morning to find one of his cows being torn apart by a wolf. The third recent attack. If he were in Montana, Wyoming, or Idaho, he could have pulled out his gun and shot the predator, but not in Colorado. Wolves are protected under state law, and killing them, no matter how many cows or sheep or pet dogs they attack, is not allowed and carries a penalty up to a $100,000 fine, a year in jail, and a lifetime loss of hunting privileges. In the span of a month, a wolf pack that roamed into northern Colorado from Wyoming had killed 2 cows and 1 border collie, badly injured 2 other cows that had to be euthanized. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife authorized an emergency resolution allowing ranchers to haze wolves by chasing them in a vehicle, firing rubber bullets at them, hiring range riders to watch the herd overnight, at their own expense, of course, or scaring them with flags hung along fence lines. Unbelievable. It wasn't just wolves that he had to contend with back home at his ranch. There were grizzlies and mountain lions after his cattle, too. His mind wandered. Why the wolf? What was the connection between wolves and people that allowed this kind of transformation to take place? Why not some other animal, like a bunny? Jack chuckled to himself. A large part of him still couldn't believe any of this was happening. He got back to the inn and retired to his room to give Kat a call. She was anxious to hear from him, and he carefully told her about his day with the Jaggers and the professor. She still didn't know why he had wanted to make the trip to Germany in the first place, and she didn't ask. She was thrilled that he was finding so much information for her. She was already planning her art installation around the subject and gave him a few more specific places to visit and a photograph for her. Well, Jack made a joke about being her research assistant, but secretly he was glad for the task she'd given him. He had 2 weeks to wait before he could meet with the professor for his cure, and he didn't know what he was going to fill those 2 weeks up with. About 70 miles from Bedburg, there was a village called Wittlich, where they say the last werewolf in Germany was killed. Why they think it was the last werewolf is hard to say. A deserter from Napoleon's army was fleeing to his homeland. While passing by the village of Wittlich, he spotted a farmhouse and decided to raid it for food. The farmer and his 2 sons returned home, found him stealing their food, and confronted him. They were killed. The farmer's wife, in her grief, called out a curse to the man, calling him a rabid wolf. He killed her too, but her curse worked. The man fled to the forest. Days later, a group of villagers found him by his campfire in the woods. They gave chase and cornered him near the village of Moorbach, and they killed him. They buried him at a crossing. There a shrine was erected, where a candle burns continually. As long as the candle is lit, so the legend goes, the werewolf will not return. Now, in 1988, a group of Air Force personnel were returning to their base at Moorbach and noticed the candle had blown out. They joked about it since everyone in the vicinity knows of the legend. Later, at the base, the automatic sirens went off. Someone or something had activated the perimeter fence sensors. While investigating, a security guard spotted a large creature that looked like a wolf standing on its hind legs. It gazed at the soldier, then jumped the 3-meter fence with ease and ran off into the woods. A police dog was brought in to track the beast, but upon arriving at the spot where the werewolf was seen, the dog began trembling and howling, refusing to go any further. Was it really a werewolf or a joke to scare the new recruits? It's hard to say, but the candle was relit, and to this day the creature has not been seen again. Jack took photos of the shrine and was sitting at a small outdoor table at a cafe nearby. He was about to send the photos to Kat when he heard squealing tires and saw a large truck careening toward him. The crash that ensued sent patrons jumping out of the way, knocking over tables and chairs in their haste. Jack barely missed being hit by the truck as it slammed into a parked vehicle and flipped over onto the sidewalk right where Jack was sitting. There were several screams mixed with the sounds of broken glass and cars honking. The truck had plowed right through a red light and into oncoming traffic before hitting the parked car and landing upside down on the sidewalk cafe. In the commotion and confusion that followed, Jack got a heady whiff of blood. He breathed it in and felt that urge that was so familiar from his dreams. He walked over to the cab of the truck and saw a man, pinned between his steering wheel and the bent door frame, a large gash across his temple. Jack felt himself swoon, dizzy and salivating. He knew he should try to help, but he couldn't shake the dizziness. He stepped away, stumbling, almost falling over a chair in his haste to get away from that overpowering, mouth-watering smell of blood. He fought back the urge to reach inside that cab, tear the man's throat, sink his teeth into his flesh. He forced himself to back away, breathing heavily. People were running now, checking vehicles for other injuries. He could hear someone asking him if he was okay. He looked up and felt his nostrils flare, his lips curl back into a snarl. The person retreated, their eyes large as they looked him in the face. It was all he could do to keep from grabbing them. He turned and he ran, letting his feet carry him away from the carnage. He had fought the beast inside himself, and he had won, this time. But it was the hardest thing he ever had to do. He hunched into a fast walk all the way back to the train station. Tried not to make eye contact with anyone along the way. He couldn't remember if he'd even paid for his food. He didn't think so. Probably no one would notice anyway, not in all that commotion. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to arch his neck and howl. He was shaking the entire train ride back to Bedburg. He tried not to think of that smell of blood. The sight of the gash on that man's head, it was just too much. Maybe if he could just kill a cat, a dog, something, it would alleviate this torture he was feeling inside. But he knew if he did, there would be no going back. No, he wasn't going to let this beast take hold of him. He could fight it, or he'd die trying. Back in Bedburg, he rushed to the inn. He ran inside and locked himself in his room. He didn't care what else Kat wanted him to do. He needed to stay locked away. He couldn't risk being around people right now. He'd tell the innkeeper he was sick, that he needed to be left alone. She could leave his food outside at the door. It would be a long 2 weeks before he could meet with Professor Luther and get his cure. He knew the innkeeper had been in his room earlier. She'd straightened up his room and gave him fresh linens. There was nothing unusual about that. But on the bedside table, he saw an oversized envelope that he hadn't noticed before. He walked over and he picked it up. It was sealed. He sliced his finger as he slid open the flap, and without thoughts, stuck his finger up to his lips and tasted the blood, immediately revolting at the taste, feeling the hunger well up inside himself again. Not for his own blood, but any taste of blood was good. He reached inside the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. They were old black and whites, obviously taken a great many years ago, perhaps the early 1900s from the looks of the clothing. He flipped through them, wondered who left them and why. when suddenly he let out a gasp. The photograph he held in his hand was a picture of a half-man, half-beast kneeling on the ground next to a young woman. The beast was looking up into the camera just as the picture had been taken. He had blood on his face and down his neck. Jack looked closely at the photo, studying the beast. The woman's face was hidden, but you could see that her clothes were ripped and soaked with blood. He turned to the next photo and felt his knees collapse. The beast had arched his neck and head into the arc of a howl, and the angle was such that he could now make out the face of the woman in the photograph. It looked exactly like Cat. The Curse of the Wolf, Part 5 of the Wolfman Series. Well, Jack pored through the photographs again and again, looking for a clue. Who put the mysterious envelope in his room? Whose photographs were these? And why does that woman look exactly like his sister Cat? Old Jack rushed downstairs to the inn's kitchen to ask the innkeeper who had left the envelope of photographs. Now, Gerta, she was cooking a large pot of beef stew on the stove, and she glanced up as Jack walked in. When asked, she replied, I was the one that put the envelope in your room, but I don't know who left it. Someone rang the bell, and when I opened the door, this was laying on the welcome mat with a little note attached that had your name on it. I looked up and down the street, and I didn't see anyone, so I brought it in, and I placed it on your night table. I assumed it would be all right since I was going to change the linens anyway. Is something wrong? Well, Jack assured her that everything was fine and turned to go back to his room. But on second thought, he turned and asked Gerda if she knew anything about the werewolf legends in this area. Oh, sure, she said. This valley has a long history of werewolves. Many years ago, wolves were abundant in our forests. Really, there were too many of them, and their prey became scarce. They started getting very bold. They would come right into town hunting for stray dogs and cats. And many children went missing too. There is a tale of a woman who was out hanging her linens on a line when a wolf came into her yard and attacked her. And as the wolves became more aggressive, the stories of men turning into wolves, they became more frequent. Gerda went back to her cooking, and Jack remembered that one of the photographs had the words Horrors Mountains written on the back. He asked Gerda if she knew anything about it. Oh, yeah, there's a very old village in the Harz Mountains where all the residents are said to be werewolves. They're gypsies. They came from Bulgaria many years ago. And the neighboring villages say that when the gypsies come into town, all the townspeople, still to this day, they rush their children and their pets inside. They mostly live on the deer and the wild game from the forest, but sometimes there are other things they hunt. The men are quite handsome, and many a young girl has lost her heart to the Romani charm, never to be seen again. Now, the women are very beautiful and sensual with their dark eyes and their olive skin. They're fortune tellers, you see. I grew up near there, and my sister still lives near the village, and she said they often come to town in an old sheep herder's wagon and park just outside of city limits to sell their wares. They say that the woods are full of men who have been seduced by the gypsy women and transformed them into wolves. If you're ever in the forest at night, you'll hear them howling. Now, there is a dark curse upon that village, Gerda replied, while she spooned out a large bowl of soup. How do I get there? Jack asked. The Harz Mountains are the land of German fairy tales. Steep-roofed, half-timber houses with narrow cobblestone streets, dark forests, rushing streams, and stormy mountains. This forest was the home of wicked witches, dwarves digging in caverns under the earth, and poor woodcutters in lonely cottages. The brothers Grimm collected their stories from this area. The highest mountain in the Harz is the Brocken. According to local legend, witches gather there every year on top of the Brocken for a German version of Halloween. The place that Jack was searching for was a little-known village far off the beaten path outside the small town of Thale, which lies at the entrance to a beautiful river gorge. It has a gondola. It takes you to the mountaintop. It's famous for pagan rituals and has a history of witchcraft and human sacrifice. Now the Hexentonsplatz, which is German for the witches' dancing place, literally, is the actual name of one of the two mountains looming over Thale. During pre-Christian times, this was an important site for secret pagan ceremonies. Legend has it that this was where the witches gathered before their flight to the Brocken, and they held human sacrifices there. Now the gondola is still operating, and Jack bought a ticket for two. Gerda was excited to accompany Jack on this trip. She hadn't seen her sister in over a year, and she had offered to take Jack to Thale so she could visit her sister. Well, Jack didn't realize that Germany was so steeped in witch and werewolf lore. He'd never really thought about it. He'd had no reason to. Oh, he'd heard of the Brothers Grimm, sure, but he grew up reading the likes of Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey. He was a cowboy, not a damn werewolf hunter. But he had to admit this was interesting, and he appreciated having Gerda's company. She was pleasant to converse with and eager to share her knowledge of the local lore. As a young girl, she and her sister had lived a life right out of a fairy tale themselves. They'd lived deep in the forest, and their father was a woodcutter, their mother was a baker. She baked loaves of bread for the storekeeper in town and would place the loaves of bread in a basket for the girls to carry to market. And believe it or not, they wore little red capes and carried the baskets of bread through the forest to leave with the storekeeper. Well, Gerda explained that many of the fairy tales that the Brothers Grimm wrote were actual stories of how life was lived back in those days. She and her sister, they had worn red hooded capes because they wanted to be sure that they were seen, much like hunters will wear orange vests today while traipsing through the forest. If men were out hunting, they wouldn't shoot at something red moving through the forest. It was for their protection. So the smell of the bread would draw wild animals to them, especially bears, but also wolves. So the girls had necklaces of garlic woven that they wore as garlic repelled the wild animals. The girls grew up with tales of werewolves and the constant fear that they might be attacked on their daily walk into town to deliver their mother's bread. She laughs about it now, but it was a real fear when she was a child. Jack and Gerda bought tickets for the gondola ride up to the top of the mountain. The views were tremendous. Jack had brought the envelope with the photographs that Gerda had left in his room, and he recognized that a couple of the photographs had this very view or something very similar in the background. And he thought about showing the photographs to Gerda, but she was busy talking with the other passengers on the gondola ride up the mountain. In the morning, before he and Gerda left, he had called both Professor Luther and Ludolf Jaeger to see if either of them had left the envelope of photographs. They both denied it and were as curious as he was of where they'd come from. It couldn't have been Rebecca. She would have invited herself right in and spent the afternoon talking with Gerda. But who else could have left that envelope? Now, Jack promised Ludolf that he would stop by after they returned from this trip to Thale. He was going to show him the envelope. And he was looking forward to his meeting with the professor the week before the full moon to start his round of tincture and hopefully be cured. Well, the envelope held 24 photographs. Most were of the same family, a man, a woman, and a young boy and a girl. The picture showed them posing in front of a camera in very formal attire, as if they were having a family portrait taken. It was difficult to judge the ages, but the period of dress and the condition of the print made him think it was from the early 1900s. An additional portrait showed them as the children were growing up. The boy appeared to be a few years older than the girl, and even as a child, there was an uncanny resemblance to his little sister, Kat. Other photos showed an old half-timber farmhouse, various pictures of the kids and the animals, and the odd photo of the werewolf kneeling over the woman, and the one with the woman whose face looked exactly like Kat's. In the background of the photos, there were mountains and a landscape that looked identical to the Harz Mountains that he and Gerda were now exploring. One of the photographs even appeared to have been taken from this very gondola. He was anxious to look around the village of Thale and see if he could identify the old farmhouse that was in several of the photographs. And why had he been led to this location in the first place? All of it appeared to be a little too familiar, yet that must be his imagination. He'd never been to Germany before, although it was possible that he had seen pictures. Suddenly, a memory sprang forward in his mind of a photo album his mother had tucked away on a high bookshelf when he was very young. Now, he'd been snooping through his parents' books, not looking for any one thing in particular. He was just bored. It was when Kat was sick with the fever, and he felt like he needed to stay near her, not go outside to play with his friends or ride his bike. His dad was away at work, and his mother had gone to the store. Kat was asleep on the sofa in the front living room, and Jack had decided to explore the books on the bookshelves. He found the photo album, and he had looked through it. He remembered seeing several photographs of a location he wasn't familiar with at the time. This location, the exact one he was now viewing. No wonder it all felt familiar. But what was the connection? And what did his family have to do with all this? And who was the family in the photographs? As he sat in silence pondering the mysterious photographs, Gerda was absorbed in a conversation with another passenger on the gondola ride up to the top of the mountain. It was a relief to have a few moments to himself. Gerda was a pleasant enough companion, but she rarely stopped talking. His thoughts drifted off again to the Jaggers. When they had first arrived in Montana and purchased that spread out by Buck Humphrey's ranch, they stuck to themselves. They didn't socialize or spend any time getting to know their neighbors. He did remember that his mother went over there with a welcome to the neighborhood, peach pie, but other than that, he didn't think his family had ever had any contact with him, at least not that he knew of. And yet, he knew the Jaggers had come from this part of Germany, and he'd met Gunther's relatives, and his mother had a photo album with pictures from this area. Now, Kat was having visions of werewolves, and Jack was now turning into one. What was the connection? Well, Jack picked up on the thread of conversation between Gerda and the other passenger that she was talking with as the gondola neared the top of the peak. They had been speaking in German, so it was easy to gloss over their conversation, but suddenly they had switched to English, and they were looking directly at Jack. The passenger, she was admiring Jack's cowboy hat. "He's a real cowboy," Gerda said proudly, "just like John Wayne. He has cows and a ranch and everything." And Jack chuckled to himself. All it takes is a cowboy hat. Well, they stepped off the platform onto the witch's dance floor. The views were spectacular. Dense forest as far as the eye could see with the waterfalls and rock formations scattered throughout the landscape. It was really breathtaking. Now, the group of tourists headed down the hiking trail, and Jack, he managed to step off the main path and go off on his own to explore. This wasn't really a sightseeing trip for him. He needed answers, and for some reason he had been led to this location. He had the feeling that there was something here he was supposed to find, some kind of sign or message well, he looked up from the path and paused. Right in front of him was a sight identical to one of his photographs. It was a tree, dead and stark against the sky on a knoll above the path. Branches dark and burnt from lightning strikes, most likely. The tree was circled by large boulders and mounds of grass. Names had been carved into the burnt bark. He climbed over the large rocks and made his way up to the tree and began searching the names carved there. It took a while to find, but there were the names he was looking for. A large carved heart circled the word, Gunther and Hannah Jaeger, married October 11, 1960, Catherine, born August 9th, 1970, Hans, born September 16th, 2000. So there was a daughter, and her name was Catherine, but Jack's sister Catherine was born on August 9th, 1970 as well. Dizziness flooded through Jack's mind. He quickly sat down. What the hell? Was this a coincidence, or was Catherine not really his sister? At least not by blood. He searched the names on the tree for anything else that looked familiar, but The names were not ones he recognized at all. He took out his phone and he snapped a photo of the tree and the inscription. Well, what's next, he wondered. Gerda and the others were waiting for him when he arrived back at the gondola landing. Gerda quickly filled him in on the landmarks she had seen. The story of the witches flying from the mountain and the festival that occurs every year to celebrate that event. He waited till they were sitting back on the gondola for the ride down the mountain to tell her about the tree. And Gerda was disappointed that the tour guide had not taken the group there. That evening, as they sat at the supper table with Gerda's sister, Jack explained that he was searching for information about a family he had known in the States, the Jaggers. He explained that he thought there might be a connection to his family and to this specific region. Gerda's sister grew more excited with every detail Jack had relayed. She was the local historian for the newspaper and thought she might be able to help him dig up some stories. Well, Jack decided to bring out the photographs and show them all to her. Luella, that was Gerda's sister's name, immediately recognized the half-timber farmhouse. I've driven by it many times. There's a family living there. Farm animals, very nice large garden. I always thought it was a very quaint, beautiful old house. Very old architecture. They don't build those half-timber homes anymore. They're very traditional. I'd love to tour it. Perhaps I can ask the managing editor if I can do a story on it, and that would give us a good excuse to snoop around and find out who's living there, see if they'll let us look around and take pictures. It's certainly worth a try. As for the Jaggers, that's a common name around here. One of the oldest families in the region, really. I suppose they're all related to each other in one way or another. Well, Jack was very grateful for the help. He retired early to give Kat a call. Meanwhile, back in Telluride, Kat was having a very successful gallery showing. Several large prints had been purchased, and she'd rubbed noses with many of the homeowners in the area, many of whom treat their million-dollar properties as their second home. Movie stars they were sports figures, politicians. You can see them all at a gallery showing in Telluride, and it wasn't even ski season yet. Well, everyone had been pleasant and welcoming except for one obnoxious customer. Kat had firmly told him no, this painting is not for sale when he inquired about her small portrait of the Wolfman, even though the plaque under the painting expressly pointed out those very words. He insisted. Kat stood her ground, and he became very agitated, a bit angry, and stormed out of the gallery, making a huge scene in front of the other patrons. It was embarrassing and uncalled for. Why that painting, she wondered. There was something about him that made her uneasy, and she thought about that as she closed up shop that afternoon. Jack was very concerned listening to Kat retell the event on the phone. Kat, be careful. There are people out there that can't be trusted. I'm worried about your safety. Oh, come on, Kat laughed. He was just a begruntled customer. I thought about removing it and bringing it home with me, but that's my favorite painting. I've not had anyone show any interest except you and now this guy. And I plan on doing a whole theme of werewolves and witches and vampires as my next installment, my next show, for Halloween that's coming up. And the other artists I've spoken to are excited about it. I think half the artists in this community are home painting werewolves right now as we speak, Kat laughed. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Jack remarked. Well, that night at dinner, Gerda's sister, Luella, she brought numerous newspaper clippings to the table that she had found in her archives at work, including a few photographs of the old farmhouse. Now, Lou agreed to take Gerda and Jack to the house in the morning. She'd already called the current owners, and they'd agreed to let her do a historical interest story on the property. Jack was thrilled. Some things were just falling right into place. Lou had also found many references to the nearby village of gypsies. More clippings contained stories about their arcane practices and philosophies, arrests for fortune-telling within city limits, their thefts, and solicitation. Jack was surprised to learn that the locals seemed to believe the idea that the residents of the neighboring village were all witches, warlocks, and werewolves. The stuff of fairy tales. When you walk through that dark forest surrounding their village, there is an atmosphere that makes your skin just crawl. You feel like you're already being watched. The woods are silent in an eerie way. No bird song, no little chipmunks scurrying underfoot. There are wild beasts out in the forest that you don't want to come across at night. We have many stories of missing tourists and locals alike who've ventured into that dark forest for one reason or another, and they're never seen again. Now, a few years ago, a story came out in our newspaper that the villagers, they had a type of contagious disease, and that was enough to keep most people away from there. But, as Gerda told you, we grew up near here. In that forest, as a matter of fact. We lived our childhoods in fear of what might kill us and eat us. We both had friends that disappeared, and we were never able to really keep animals as pets. Whenever a dog or a cat went missing, we always blamed it on the gypsies. The truth is, they are an unusual lot. They often come to town to trade their handmade trinkets and their herbal concoctions, or they set up a table to do fortune-telling in exchange for medicine, food, and tools. What they can't steal, they barter for. I don't think they have any actual monetary exchange in their village. It's all a system of barter. So many of the younger ones end up leaving the village and coming over to our town to work. But they don't stay here very long. The townspeople make them feel very unwelcome. But there are herbalists, and some members of our community swear by their natural remedies. They also make amulets, and those amulets are meant to keep werewolves and curses away. The tourists eat that kind of stuff up. They dress up in their traditional gypsy garb and pull up in their old sheep herders' wagons and set up a little market right at city limits, just outside of town, and also just out of the local gendarme's jurisdiction. Well, they'll tell fortunes and sell their trinkets and jewelry and herbal remedies. I've heard tell that the men can purchase an hour of pleasure with some of the ladies while their husbands stand guard outside. But that's merely gossip. Wouldn't surprise me, though. But every year, someone wanders into that forest and disappears. Kids, dogs, hunters, or the occasional teenager seeking some adventure. There's never any evidence to prove it was them. It's all very mysterious. You might call it superstitious nonsense. But old legends don't die around here, she added. The next morning, they had a quick breakfast and left in Luella's car to visit the house in Jack's photograph. It looked much the same as Ludolf Jaggers. It was a half-timber farmhouse built in the late 1600s, with animal stalls on the lower floor and the living quarters upstairs. Now, the current owners had done some remodeling, and there was scaffolding set up on one wall of the house where some of the plaster needed repair. The owners came out to greet him as they drove up to the house. Luella took on the role of historian and editor and made it all look very official, taking photographs, interviewing the couple. Jack, he had an opportunity to search for the cornerstone with the original owner's name engraved. As was the custom with these old houses, the name was not one he recognized right away, but he snapped a photograph with his phone and joined the rest of the group. The new owners did not know much of the history of the place, but they did recognize their house in Jack's photographs when he showed them. They said that they had purchased the home from a developer, and that he might be someone to contact for more information on the history of the home. They toured the grounds and the redesigned interior, took photos for Luella's story, then drove into town to visit the developer. Carl von Cleve was a heavy-set man who spent a lot of time sitting behind a desk. He boasted that he had lived in this little community for over 50 years and knew every part and parcel in the vicinity. He was good friends with Luella and invited the three to join him for lunch. Jack could tell he hadn't missed many meals, you see. The four walked to a nearby diner, while Carl regaled them with stories of his exploits as a kid. He seemed a likable, trustworthy fellow at first glance, and Jack decided he would pull out the envelope of photographs during lunch and ask Carl if he could identify the people in the photo. Well, Carl took one look and said, "Why, of course I know who these people are. They're the ones I bought the old farmhouse from. Wilhelm and Prudence Kell." She was a beauty. Back in the day, one of the prettiest of the Jaeger girls. She fell in love with Wilhelm and married him, even though her dad threatened to disown her. He didn't feel Wilhelm was worthy of his daughter. It's an unfortunate story how I came to purchase the house from him. You see, in these parts, you leave your property to your children. It had been left in the Kell family for generations, and he and Prudence had 2 children. They had a boy and they had a girl. The boy was always a little bit off, if you know what I mean, troubled. The girl was beautiful like her mother. Wilhelm, he took to drinking and liked to beat the boy something fierce. Well, the boy just snapped one day and nearly killed his father. He was sent away and became one of Hitler's henchmen during the war, from what I hear. And then the girl, well, she ran off with one of the gypsies, and no one knows what became of her. So Wilhelm and Prudence, they were getting up there in years, and they had no heirs to leave the farm to. So they were forced to sell. Now, I bought the property, and then I resold it to the folks that you met this morning. Not much else to the story, I'm afraid. Carl ended as the waitress came with their meals. Jack was still puzzled about how these were all connected to the photographs and how he and Kat fit into this picture. It was like trying to put together a big crossword puzzle, and some of the pieces were still missing. There was one more place Jack wanted to go. He wanted to see that village of gypsies. He couldn't help but feel that somehow that place was connected, and he wanted to bring back an amulet for Kat. She would find it interesting and maybe be able to use it in her art installation. He asked if he could borrow Gerda's car for the afternoon. She reluctantly complied. She'd taken to Mother and him, and he'd just about had enough of that. He needed to have the peace and quiet of the afternoon to himself. The women had been very helpful, but he needed to figure the rest of this out by himself. He drove out of town, and he followed a forested lane for several miles to a dirt road turnoff. It was indicated by a simple sign that had a circle with a cross through it and another symbol under that, which Jack did not recognize. The narrow dirt lane ended another mile up the road. The forest was very dark and dense. A few small wooden houses were tucked into the trees. They were becoming closer together as he reached the outer boundary of this small village. It did have an ominous feel to it, he noticed. All the houses were very small, and none of them had any landscaping of any kind. There were no fences, but many had rusty vehicles and farm implements, and occasionally a dog or a goat would be tethered to a post at the corner of the house. There were clothes on the line at several of the houses and a few children playing outside. He saw faces looking at him through windows and doorways, but no one gave the appearance of being welcoming or friendly. Every glance he received looked suspicious. A few of the women came out of the houses and stared at him, their hands on their hips, with their hair tied up in scarves. He drove through town very slowly, watching them as they watched him. He saw no men at all, not a single one. He thought that was very strange, but he figured they were out working in the forest, cutting timber, or whatever else they did. And it didn't take long to reach the far side of the village. There were no stores, no cafes, no merchants, just homes. No wonder they came into Luella's village for the things they needed. There was really nothing more than a big compound of homes. So the road led on into the forest. He didn't see any reason to go any further, so he turned the car around and started back through the narrow street. He saw a woman standing at her front door and pulled the car up to a stop in front of her house. He gave a slight wave to see if she would respond. Well, she didn't. He decided to take a chance, and he stepped out of the car. Asked her if she could direct him to some place he could purchase something for his sister. He couldn't think of anything better to ask. The woman raised her hand up to her eyes as if shielding them from the sun and waved for him to come forward with her other hand. He felt nervous and he felt tense. He felt vulnerable. He realized that he didn't have his gun, and the pocket knife he carried wouldn't really make much of a dent if he was attacked. But he walked towards the woman anyway. She was very lovely, with beautiful dark eyes that had a sensuality to them that was unnerving. Jack explained that he wanted to buy an amulet for his sister, and the woman laughed. She reached up and touched his face and ran her fingers down his neck to the point where his shirt was unbuttoned, and nodded with her head, beckoning him to come inside. He understood how easily a man could succumb to this wild gypsy charm. He nodded his head no. He wouldn't fall for her seduction. He turned to leave and took a step towards his car. In that instant, she sprang at him. He heard his shirt rip and felt razor-sharp fingernails across his back. He whipped around and grabbed her by the back of the neck, pulling her hair and forcing her head to tilt back, while he grabbed her arm with his other hand. She let out a hissing growl and her lips curled back into a snarl. He felt the beast rise within himself. His blood was pounding in his ears, and he felt the saliva forming in his mouth, the fangs beginning to come forward. She tore at him with her free hand, but he was much stronger, and he forced her down to the ground, pinning her arms with his knees and keeping one hand against her throat. She struggled with all her might to break free of him, to bite him, but he kept her pinned. He had never hit a woman in his life, but this was not a woman. Even as he held her down, she had begun her transformation. He swung back and planted a powerful blow to her chin. She let out an unearthly howl, and Jack raised his head and howled in return. It was the first time the primitive sound had escaped his lips, and it felt good. He clenched his teeth together, and he felt his lips rise into a snarl. He was the dominant beast, and she cowered and settled, becoming a woman again. He got up off of her, and they shared a look of understanding. He turned, and he walked back to the car. And as he drove away, the women came out of the houses and watched him. He was one of them, and they let him leave. As he reached the end of the dirt road where the sign with the circle pointed towards the village, there was an old woman standing there. She raised her hand. She beckoned for him to stop. He pulled the car up beside her, and she handed him an amulet attached to a leather thong to hang around his neck. It looked as if it had been crudely carved from bone, and it bore the symbol of the circle with the cross through it and that mysterious symbol underneath it. She whispered, "Wear this for protection. As long as you wear the amulet, you may walk among men." Then she spoke some words in a language he didn't recognize, and she touched his forehead with her fingertip. He nodded a thanks to her, and he drove away. Gerda met him at the door when he reached Lou's house. "We were worried about you," she said. There's someone here who's asked to speak to you." He followed Gerda into Lou's dining room, where he sat with a woman who looked ancient. She had long gray hair and braids that were twisted with beads and little bells that tinkled when she moved. Her face was weathered and deeply wrinkled, and her eyes were dark and rheumy. She wore many strands of beads around her neck and a faded yellow peasant-style blouse and a long, dark, purple-colored skirt. If ever there were a fortune-teller straight from the movies, this was it. Wrinkled, bony fingers grasped Jack's hand and turned it over, studying his palm. Her fingers traced the lines in his palm. "You have the mark of the wolf, but you are not a killer, Jack Moore. You are a hunter, and you are needed back home. You must leave immediately. Your sister is in danger." "My sister?" Jack quickly asked. "What do you know about my sister?" The old woman held her finger up to her lips and whispered, "Shh. You have secrets you must keep. Your sister comes from a long line of the Volkolak. They came from Bulgaria in 1500s. Their line is strong. She was given to your mother for protection, and now you are her protector. You bear the mark of the wolf, and it is your duty to protect the queen of the gypsies." "Gypsies?" Jack asked. "When Catherine was born, she bore the mark of the wolf, but her father was a gypsy. Catherine was the child of Hanna Jaeger's lover. If Gunther had known his wife was pregnant with another man's child, he would have killed her. So she fled to the United States and gave her daughter to her sister, your mother. Gunther tracked her down and found her in Montana. She refused to come back to Germany with him, So he stayed there. Much later, Hans was born, and he too bore the mark of the wolf. Your sister Catherine's father is my son. Jack's head just spun with dizziness. This was all so difficult to take in. There were still so many unanswered questions. His mother was Hannah Jaeger's sister? Catherine was Hannah's daughter? Wow. So Catherine and Hans were really siblings. And why had Jack's mom and dad kept this a secret for all these years? Jack was 5 when Catherine was born. He never questioned his mother when she brought baby Catherine home. Now that he thought about it, though, he didn't really remember seeing his mother pregnant, but he was 5, and it never occurred to him that there was anything strange about that. And if Gunther, Hannah, and Hans were all werewolves, what did that make Cat? And why was Cat in danger now? The old gypsy woman shook her head and told Jack she could say no more, that all would be revealed in time. Jack and Gerda left early the next morning to head back to Bedburg. Jack's flight was scheduled for later that afternoon, and he knew he had barely enough time to pack and take the train to Dusseldorf, where he would catch the flight back to the States. He tried repeatedly to call Catherine, but she was not answering her phone. He did phone Ludolf Jaeger to apologize for leaving so quickly and promised he'd be in touch. Then he made the phone call that he was dreading. Professor Luther should have been disappointed that he wouldn't be able to try out the effects of his cure, but he appeared to be more disappointed that he wouldn't be able to gather some of Jack's blood. There was something in the way he responded that made Jack feel uncomfortable. Perhaps Luther was not being truthful with him. Well, it didn't matter now. Jack had to return to the States quickly. Catherine, she was in danger, and Jack's cure would have to be postponed for now. During the flight, Jack tried to put all the pieces together. He'd gone to Germany to find a cure for the changes that were occurring inside himself, changing him from a man to a wolf. He'd gone specifically to seek out information about the Jaeger clan so he'd better understand what had made them change into wolves in the first place. Not only had he found the relations of the Jaegers, but he had learned that his life was connected to theirs in a way that he never could have dreamed of. He dozed fitfully. His hands moved involuntarily up to his amulet he wore around his neck. In his dreams, he felt himself running, forever running. Catherine had arrived at the gallery early, only to find the glass display window on the right side of the door had been smashed in. Broken glass littered the sidewalk in front of her gallery. She gasped. Her alarm had not gone off. She quickly dialed the police department to report the break-in. The dispatcher took down all the information and told her not to go inside, but she was to wait until the officers arrived. So as she stood outside the new gallery crying, she tried to reach her brother by telephone. She saw that she had several messages from him. Funny that she didn't hear her phone ring, she thought to herself. He said he was on his way home and something about danger. The 2 officers arrived and made sure it was safe for Catherine to enter. Inside, there didn't appear to be any real damage other than broken glass everywhere. None of the paintings were missing, she thought, until she noticed the empty space in the far back of the gallery. Her painting of the werewolf was gone. In its place was a handwritten note that read, "I'm coming for you next."